The September sun hung merciless over Cutter's Bend, turning the wooden platform into a griddle of broken dreams. Heat rose in shimmering waves from the planks warping the air, making everything look uncertain and half real like a promise no one intended to keep. The kind of heat that made a person question whether the ground beneath their feet was solid or just another trick played by a world that had run out of kindness a long time ago. Marin Ellery stood at the far end of that platform position, number 12 out of 13, her worn carpet bag clutched between gloved hands that had long since stopped trembling. She had learned over the course of 7 brutal years that trembling was a luxury reserved for women who still had something left to lose. Marin had lost everything worth losing a long time ago. What remained was bone and will and the stubborn refusal to disappear entirely from a world that seemed determined to forget she existed. 22 years old. That was the number etched into the registration form Mrs. Headley had thrust at her that morning, along with her name, her place of origin, in the careful notation, no family, no property, no references of standing. The words had been written in precise black ink, each letter a small verdict, a quiet sentencing. No family, no property, no references, no value. The kind of summation that reduced an entire human life to a column of absences, a ledger of things missing a balance sheet that showed nothing but debt. She had arrived in Cutter's Bend on the morning train, stepping down onto the platform with 12 other women, each of them carrying some version of the same desperate arithmetic. A woman alone in 1878 had a narrow set of options, and every one of them led somewhere cold. You could work until your fingers bled in some factory back east, standing at a loom for 14 hours, until your vision blurred and your spine curved into the shape of permanent surrender. You could hire yourself out as a domestic, scrubbing other women's floors, until your knees gave out and they replaced you with someone younger and less worn. You could attach yourself to some charitable institution and spend your remaining years as an object of pity, fed and housed, but never truly alive. Or you could stand on a platform in a frontier town and hope that some man, any man, would look at you and see something worth claiming. 6 times before this day, Marin had chosen the platform. 6 times she had dressed in her best, pinned her hair, straightened her spine, and presented herself to be evaluated like merchandise on a shelf. And 6 times she had watched men's eyes slide past her face like water over smooth stone landing. Instead, on younger faces, rounder figures, the kind of soft prettiness that promised easy domesticity and uncomplicated futures. The reasons varied from town to town, but amounted to the same verdict. Too thin, too small. Eyes too sharp, too knowing, too much intelligence looking back at men who wanted compliance, not conversation. She was not ugly. She knew that with the clinical detachment of a woman who had spent too many hours examining her own face in clouded mirrors, searching for the flaw that made her invisible. But she was not the kind of beautiful that made men stop and stare, and in the brutal marketplace of frontier bride selection, anything less than stopping power meant you might as well be made of air. The platform filled with women around her. 13 souls in varying states of desperation, each one carrying her own private catastrophe beneath whatever composure she could manage. Some were recent widows with the hollow look of women who had watched the ground swallow the only person who had ever chosen them. Some were orphans like Marin, cast loose into a world that had no particular use for unattached women. Some had fled situations too dark to speak of in polite company, carrying bruises that had faded from the skin, but not from the memory. All of them had arrived at the same conclusion, that standing on this platform, submitting to the inspection of strange men, was preferable to whatever they had left behind. To Marin's right stood a wisp of a girl, barely 19, golden-haired and trembling, so hard her Sunday dress shook like a leaf in autumn wind. She was gripping a small leather Bible with white-knuckled hands, and her eyes darted across the gathering crowd with the wee, terrified expression of a rabbit that had just realized it was standing in an open field with nowhere to hide, and something large moving toward it through the grass. "First time?" Marin asked quietly. The girl nodded without meeting her eyes. Yes, ma'am. My father passed last winter. Farm got sold for debts. I got nowhere else. She paused, her lower lip quivering with the effort of holding together. My name's Pearl. Pearl Ashby. Marin. She kept her voice steady, warm, without being pitying, the way you might speak to a horse that had been spooked and needed to know that the hand reaching toward it meant no harm. You'll be fine, Pearl. Just stand straight and answer honestly when they speak to you. Have you done this before? Once or twice, Marin lied. No need to terrify the girl with the truth. No need to explain what it felt like to stand silent and still while men's eyes slid past you like you were made of smoke, time after time, town after town, until you began to wonder if perhaps you really were invisible, if perhaps the world was right, and you simply did not merit the space you occupied. Girls like Pearl always got chosen. Marin could see it already in the way the morning light caught Pearl's golden hair, turning it into something that looked almost sacred, almost touched by grace, in the soft curve of her cheek, in the youthful vulnerability that made men feel powerful and needed, that awakened in them the ancient satisfying impulse to protect something fragile and be rewarded with gratitude. Some farmer or shopkeeper would claim Pearl before the hour was out, and she would ride away into her new life with the relieved joy of someone pulled from deep water just before drowning. Women like Marin were the ones who remained on the platform after the choosing was done, gathering their carpet bags and their composure, walking to the train station with measured steps that betrayed nothing of the devastation inside, buying tickets to the next town, the next platform, the next performance of hope and humiliation. It was a script she had memorized through 7 years of rehearsal, and each performance was a little more hollow than the last, a little more mechanical, a little more like watching yourself from the outside as the woman you used to be went through motions that had lost all meaning. Mrs. Headley clapped her hands sharply, cutting through the murmur of nervous conversation like a blade through cheap cloth. She was a stern-faced woman of 50, appointed by the Women's Settlement Society to oversee these proceedings with the brisk efficiency of a quartermaster distributing rations. There was no sentiment in her clipboard, no romance in her registration numbers. This was logistics. This was the organized distribution of female bodies to male households that required them dressed up in the language of propriety and Christian charity, but stripped bare of everything except the raw transaction beneath. Ladies, please form a line according to your registration numbers. Gentlemen will begin viewing at 2:30. Remember, you are here as prospective brides, not cattle. Maintain your dignity. Marin almost laughed at that, dignity, as if dignity put food on a table or kept a roof overhead during a Montana winter. As if dignity meant anything when desperation had carved itself into your bones so deep you could feel it in your teeth every time you tried to smile. Dignity was a word used by people who had never been hungry enough to eat their pride and find it did not fill the emptiness. She took her place. Number 12 out of 13. The smell of cheap perfume mixed with fierce sweat hung in the hot air like a fog that could not quite dissipate. Somewhere down the line, a woman was crying softly, the sound barely audible but unmistakable. The particular music of a heart that was already breaking before the breaking had officially begun. Another was praying under her breath, the words tumbling out in a stream of petition aimed at a sky that showed no sign of listening. Marin did neither. She had cried herself empty 3 years ago, somewhere between her third and fourth rejection, in a boarding house in Cheyenne where the walls were so thin she could hear the woman in the next room doing the same thing. And prayer was for people who still believed someone was listening, who still had faith that the silence overhead was attentive rather than empty. The men came at 2:30 exactly as scheduled, 15 of them moving in a loose cluster across the hard-packed ground, boots heavy on the wooden planks. Ranchers and shopkeepers and farmers, and a blacksmith still wearing his leather apron, the lot of them carrying the particular nervous energy of men about to make decisions they did not fully understand about lives they could not fully predict. They moved down the line with varying degrees of interest, some bashful and awkward, some bold and appraising, all of them performing the same calculation behind their eyes. Could this woman cook clean, bear children, endure the isolation of frontier life without going mad or running back east on the first available train? It happened exactly as Marin knew it would. Exactly as it had happened 6 times before, in 6 different towns on 6 different platforms under 6 different skies, that all looked the same when you were standing beneath them waiting to be found wanting. The first man, a solid-looking farmer named Burris with sun-weathered hands and an honest face, stopped in front of Pearl. Marin watched the exchange with the quiet detachment of someone who had memorized this particular script and could recite every line before it was spoken. "Name Pearl Ashby, sir. You cook, yes, sir, and sew and keep house." He raised his hand, the signal of selection. Mrs. Headley marked her clipboard with the precise notation of a woman recording a successful transaction. Pearl let out a small gasp of relief that sounded like the first breath taken after nearly drowning, and Marin felt genuinely glad for her. One less soul going under. The selection continued with the steady rhythm of an auction conducted in whispers. A quiet brunette named Sarah went to a shopkeeper with kind eyes. A plump and cheerful woman named Molly was claimed by a rancher who looked gentle in the way that large men sometimes are careful with their strength because they understood its consequences. One by one, hands rose. Names were marked. Futures decided in the space between heartbeats, entire lives pivoting on the axis of a single moment, a single glance, a single calculation made by a stranger who would become the most important person in your world. And through it all, Marin stood perfectly still. Men's eyes touched her face and slid away quick as minnows in shallow water. She was too thin, too small. Her eyes held too much intelligence, too much awareness, too much of the hard knowing that came from 7 years of surviving on her own in a world that had never once made survival easy. Men wanted softness. They wanted yielding. They wanted women who looked like they would bend when pushed rather than push back. And Marin had lost her softness the way one loses baby teeth gradually, and then all at once replaced by something harder, sharper, more functional, but infinitely less appealing to men who were shopping for comfort rather than capability. By 3 o'clock, only 3 women remained unchosen. Marin, a hard-faced woman named Ida, who had cursed loudly and magnificently at one potential suitor when he asked if she could keep quiet when a man was thinking. And when a widow of 45 who stood with the bone-deep patience of someone who had already survived worse than rejection and knew that whatever happened next, she would survive this too. The remaining men, 2 of them looked uncomfortable in the way that men look uncomfortable when they realize they are about to disappoint someone, and there is no way to avoid it. One was ancient, probably 70, with tobacco-stained whiskers and hands that shook with palsy. The other was barely 20, pimpled and visibly nervous, clearly having scraped together every penny for the registration fee. The old man approached Ida, who crossed her arms and glared him into retreat with the withering force of a woman who would rather starve than settle. The boy approached Wynne, took one look at her weathered face and the steel in her quiet eyes, and backed away, stuttering apologies. Neither looked at Myron. Neither even glanced in her direction. She might as well have been a fence post. She might as well have been the shadow of a fence post, something that existed only because something else blocked the light. 7th time. The number landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward through the carefully constructed calm she had maintained all day. 7 platforms, 7 towns. 7 times she had dressed in her best, stood in the sun, presented herself for inspection, and been found wanting by every standard that mattered in this world. The mathematics of her situation were now so clear they were almost elegant in their cruelty. She was not what these men wanted. She would never be what these men wanted. And continuing to pretend otherwise was not courage. It was delusion wearing courage's clothes, and the disguise was getting threadbare. Mrs. Headley consulted her clipboard with the expression of a woman calculating acceptable losses. Ladies, I'm afraid the selection process has concluded. The society can provide return fare to your point of origin, or alternatively, got money for the return fare? Ida interrupted, her voice carrying the rough authority of a woman who had never needed anyone's charity and was not about to start now. Don't need your speech. As do I, Wynne said quietly. Thank you for the opportunity. Marin said nothing. She had $17 folded in the lining of her carpet bag, enough to reach Denver, maybe San Francisco if she was careful, if she ate only once a day and slept sitting up on the train to avoid paying for a berth, enough to start over one more time in some new city where no one knew her name or her history, where she could find work as a seamstress or a laundress or a companion to some demanding old woman exchanging her time and her dignity for a roof and 3 meals, surviving, but never living, existing but never belonging. She reached for her carpet bag. Her muscles moved with the particular numbness that came after you had bled out all feeling, after hope had drained away so completely that what remained was not despair, but something quieter, something almost peaceful in its finality. The peace of surrender. The calm of a woman who had finally stopped fighting the current and was simply letting it carry her wherever it chose to go. She would walk to the station, buy her ticket, ride west into the setting sun, and whatever waited there. She took 3 steps toward the stairs, and then the world cracked open. The sound hit first, hooves striking hard-packed dirt at full gallop. Not one horse, but 3, their rhythm, a rolling thunder that made the platform vibrate under Marin's feet and sent a tremor up through her bones. Then came the shouts of men scrambling out of the way, the sharp whinny of horses being reined hard, and the explosive percussion of gravel spraying in all directions as 3 massive animals slid to a halt in a cloud of dust so thick it obscured everything for a breathless moment, as if the earth itself had exhaled and the whole world disappeared behind its breath. Marin turned. Everyone turned. 3 horses stood heaving in the settling dust. A bay stallion, enormous and dark-eyed, its muscles still quivering with the force of the run. A black gelding with a white blaze cutting down its face like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. A chestnut mare the color of old copper tossing her head and snorting steam into the hot afternoon air. And 3 men already dismounting before their horses had fully stopped boots, hitting ground with the decisive force of hammers driving nails into something that was meant to hold. The brothers Drummond. Even Marin, new to this town, having arrived only that morning, knew the name. Everyone in Montana Territory knew the name. Everett Beckett and Soren Drummond triplet brothers, who owned and operated Elkhorn Ridge Ranch, the largest spread in 3 territories. But Elkhorn Ridge was no ordinary ranch. It sat high in the mountains, 18,000 acres of good grassland in a valley so remote that winter storms could seal the road for weeks at a time. The brothers Drummond were mountain men in the truest sense, men who had built their empire in the wilderness, who lived by the law of the land and the strength of their own hands, who came down to civilization only when civilization had something they needed and could not provide for themselves. Their word carried weight in territorial politics. Their reputation preceded them like thunder before lightning. And they had just arrived late, in dust-covered and radiating an energy that made the air on the platform feel suddenly charged, as if a storm had rolled in from the mountains without warning. They were tall. That was the first thing that registered the most immediate and overwhelming impression. All 3 stood well over 6 feet with the broad-shouldered, lean-hipped build of men who had worked hard every day of their lives in country that did not forgive weakness and whose bodies had been shaped by that work into instruments of pure capability. Trail dust coated their clothes in a fine gray layer that spoke of hard riding through darkness of hours in the saddle, without rest, of a determination that had driven them through the night to reach this place at this time for reasons that the watching crowd could not yet comprehend. Their hats were pushed back, revealing 3 faces that were identical in their fundamental architecture, but distinct in their expression like three variations on a single demanding theme played in different keys. Three pairs of amber eyes, the color of whiskey, held up to firelight, swept the platform simultaneously. And the weight of those six eyes moving across the assembled crowd was like the weight of the mountains themselves, heavy and ancient, and absolutely certain of what they were looking for. The one in front, the one who radiated authority without requesting it and commanded attention without raising his voice, spoke first. His voice carried across the platform with the natural projection of a man accustomed to being heard across vast distances, across mountain valleys, across the kind of silence that existed only in places where the nearest neighbor was a day's ride away. I'm here for the bride selection. I know we're late. Trail got blocked by a slide north of the pass. We rode through the night to make it. Mr. Drummond. Mrs. Headley recovered her composure with visible effort, her clipboard clutched like a shield against the sheer physical force of three men who seemed to occupy twice the space that normal men required. We've already completed the selection process. I'm afraid all suitable matches have been made. However, given your family's standing in the community, I'm certain we could arrange for a special selection from our next group, arriving in... Don't need a special selection. Everett Drummond's gaze had settled on the three remaining women with the careful, thorough attention of a man who evaluated everything he encountered, not with cruelty, but with the absolute precision of someone who understood that good decisions required good information, and that the cost of a bad decision was paid not in money but in years of regret. His brothers flanked him, Beckett on his left, Soren on his right, and they too were studying the platform with identical amber intensity, six eyes performing the same calculation from three slightly different angles. Ada lifted her chin defiantly, the gesture of a woman who would not be cowed even by the most powerful family in the territory. Wynne simply looked tired, way old soldiers looked tired beyond caring what happened next, because caring required an energy she had spent a long time ago. And Marin stood frozen and with her carpet bag in one hand and her other hand still reaching toward the stair railing, caught between the momentum of departure and the gravitational pull of something she did not yet understand, something that was happening in the amber eyes of the man who was now looking at her with an attention that felt like being touched. Then Everett started walking, past Mrs. Headley, who reached out as if to stop him, and then thought better of it, her hand dropping to her side like a bird that had forgotten how to fly. Past the small cluster of remaining townspeople who had stayed to watch their faces frozen in expressions of surprise and speculation. Past Ida, who watched him with narrow-eyed suspicion. Past Wynne, who did not even look up. He stopped directly in front of Marin, and his brother stopped with him. Beckett to her left, Soren to her right. Three massive men forming a half circle around a woman who barely reached their shoulders. Three sets of amber eyes focused on her face with an intensity that made the September heat feel cold by comparison, that made the entire vast Montana sky seem small, that reduced the whole world to the space between one breath and the next. Marin could smell horse and leather and the clean, honest sweat of men who had ridden hard through darkness to reach this place. She could see the fine lines at the corners of Everett's eyes carved there by years of squinting against sun and wind and the particular brightness of mountain snow. The scar cutting through his left eyebrow, a thin white line that spoke of some old violence, absorbed and survived and carried forward as evidence rather than complaint. The way his hands work, roughened and capable, hung loose at his sides without aggression or threat. The hands of a man who had nothing to prove about his strength, because the proof was in every callus, every scar, every acre of mountain land he had wrestled into submission. Name, he asked. Her voice came from somewhere far away from some part of herself that was still functioning, while the rest of her stood paralyzed by the impossibility of what was happening. Marin Ellery. Age. She could have lied. Every instinct born of 7 years of survival told her to shave off a year, 2 years, to make herself more palatable, more marketable, more likely to be chosen by men who measured a woman's worth in the currency of youth. But something in those amber eyes, something in the direct, uncompromising way he looked at her, demanded truth. Not the polished, carefully edited truth of social presentation, but the raw, unvarnished kind that left you exposed and vulnerable and strangely, terrifyingly free. 22. Beckett spoke next, his voice carrying the precise analytical quality of a man who thought in numbers and outcomes, and the cold logic of systems that either worked or did not. You read and write keep books. I was a school teacher before circumstances changed, and I kept books for my father's general store until he died. Soren on her right spoke last. His voice was lighter than his brother's, carrying warmth that the other two seemed to have burned away through years of hard mountain living, a warmth that suggested there was at least one Drummond brother who still remembered that the world contained laughter as well as labor. How many times have you been passed over before today? The question should have humiliated her, should have sent her shrinking back into the protective shell of shame she had built around this particular wound over 7 years of accumulating the same hurt. Instead, delivered with that quiet directness, it felt like a key turning in a lock, opening something she had kept sealed shut for so long, she had forgotten what it contained. 6. Today makes 7. A murmur rippled through the watching crowd, 7 times. The number moved through the remaining spectators like wind through dry grass, carrying with it all the weight of accumulated failure, accumulated rejection. The slow, crushing mathematics of a woman who had been weighed and measured and found wanting over and over and over again until the wanting itself had become the defining characteristic of her existence. Everett did not react to the murmur. His expression did not change, but something flickered in those amber eyes, quick as heat, lightning across a summer sky, something that might have been recognition. The recognition of one survivor looking at another across the no man's land of other people's judgment and seeing not pity, not charity, but the reflection of a familiar endurance. You keep trying anyway, he said, not a question. I keep trying. Why serve my? Such a simple word, such an impossible question. Why did she keep subjecting herself to this ritual humiliation? Why did she not simply accept the verdict the world had rendered and fade quietly into whatever marginal existence was deemed appropriate for women like her? Why did she insist on standing up when the universe kept knocking her down with the patient, methodical efficiency of a force that would never tire of the exercises? Because the alternative is worse, Marin said. The three brothers exchanged a look. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but Marin watched something pass between them that went beyond language, a silent conversation conducted in the shorthand of men who had shared a womb, shared a childhood, shared the brutal work of building an empire from raw mountain earth and sheer will. 34 years of reading each other's faces had given them a communication system that needed no words, and in those 2 seconds, something was decided. Something that would change the trajectory of 4 lives and send ripples outward through a community that had already decided how this story was supposed to end. Everett turned back to her. We own a ranch 15 miles north of here, up in the mountains. Elkhorn Ridge. Biggest spread in the valley, 18,000 acres, good water cattle and horses. 3 brothers, no wives. The place sits high and winters seal the road for weeks. It needs managing that goes beyond what 3 men can handle on their own. Beckett picked up without pause, as if they had rehearsed this, though Marin understood instinctively that they had not. This was simply how they spoke, 3 voices carrying a single thought, the way 3 streams carry a single current toward the sea. We need someone to run the household, manage supplies, keep books, feed 35 working men 3 meals a day, and handle the logistics that keep an operation this size functioning through conditions most people wouldn't survive. Soren completed the thought, his lighter voice carrying an undercurrent of something warmer than his brother's pragmatism, something that suggested he understood that what they were asking went beyond job description and into the territory of the heart. And you'd need to be strong enough to handle 3 stubborn men who've been on their own too long and forgotten what it's like to share a roof with someone who sees through their nonsense. That's not easy work either. The platform had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Headley stood with her clipboard forgotten at her side, her mouth slightly open in an expression that suggested she was witnessing something that fell outside every category her considerable organizational experience had prepared her for. The remaining townspeople stared with expressions ranging from disbelief to barely concealed scandal. Ida's eyebrows had climbed nearly to her hairline. Wynne was watching with the first flicker of genuine interest she had shown all day, the tired eyes suddenly alert. Everett raised his voice so the entire platform could hear, though his eyes never left Marin's face. "Marin Ellery, would you be willing to enter a courtship with the intention of marriage?" The explosion of reaction was immediate and visceral. Shocked whispers became open exclamations. Mrs. Headley made a small choking sound that was half professional disapproval and half the involuntary response of a woman witnessing something extraordinary. Someone in the crowd said clearly, "But she's the one nobody wanted," and someone else shushed them with violent urgency as if the words themselves were dangerous and needed to be silenced before they did more damage. Pearl Ashby already claimed, in standing with her farmer Burris, had tears streaming down her young face, one hand pressed to her mouth to contain whatever sound was trying to escape. Ida snorted something that sounded remarkably like approval, the grudging respect of one fighter acknowledging another's unexpected victory, and Wynn's quiet addition, barely audible above the noise, carried the weight of a woman who had lived long enough to know the difference between luck and justice. Some men know what they're looking for. Rest are just fools shopping for pretty. And Marin stood in the center of this hurricane of reaction and felt something she had not felt in so long she barely recognized it. Not quite hope. She had learned better than hope. Had learned that hope was the cruelest of emotions because it opened you up to the very damage you were trying to survive. But something adjacent to it, something dangerous and fragile, like the first green shoot pushing through scorched earth after a fire. The knowledge that she had been seen, that three men had looked at her, truly looked, and found not a woman to be pitied or passed over, but a woman worth choosing. "Yes," she heard herself say, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "I'd be willing to enter a courtship." Everett nodded once the decisive motion of a man who made choices and stood by them regardless of what the world thought about those choices. He turned to Mrs. Headley. "What's the proper procedure?" The coordinator recovered with professional determination, reaching for the familiar comfort of process and protocol. "A supervised courtship of 1 week. Separate accommodations naturally. Chaperone meetings to determine compatibility. If both parties agree, at the end of the week, marriage can proceed with the society's blessing." "Fine. Where is she staying?" "The society maintains rooms at Mrs. Calder's boarding house on—" "We'll cover her expenses." Everett pulled a leather wallet from his vest pocket and counted out bills with the easy confidence of a man for whom money was a tool, not a source of anxiety, not a measure of worth, simply a means of getting things done. He handed the payment to Mrs. Headley. "1 week. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, we'll call on her." That acceptable? He directed this last question at Marin, and something about the fact that he asked that he sought her agreement rather than simply announcing his plans loosened a knot in her chest that she had not even known was there. A small thing. A man asking a woman's permission before deciding her schedule. But in a world where women's schedules were decided for them, as a matter of course, it was not small at all. "Yes," she said, "that's acceptable." Everett touched the brim of his hat. Beckett mirrored the gesture from her left, Soren from her right. Three identical movements synchronized with the precision of men who had been moving in concert their entire lives, three variations on respect expressed through a gesture so simple, it could have been dismissed as ordinary, if not for the weight it carried in that moment. Then they turned and walked back to their horses, the crowd parting automatically to let them pass, parting the way, Water parts for stones drop from a height not by choice, but by physics, by the simple reality that some forces cannot be resisted. Everett mounted his bay stallion in one fluid motion. Beckett swung onto the black gelding. Soren settled into the chestnut mare's saddle with the easy grace of a man who spent more time on horseback than on foot, and was more comfortable in a saddle than in any chair ever built. They wheeled their horses as one and rode out in the same cloud of dust. They had arrived in three figures growing smaller against the vast Montana landscape, against the mountains that rose behind the town, like the spine of the world until they disappeared around a bend in the road and were gone. The silence they left behind lasted exactly 3 seconds before the platform erupted. Marin stood motionless in the storm of noise, her carpetbag still clutched in numb hands, trying to process what had just happened. Around her, voices rose in speculation, gossip, outright disbelief. She caught fragments through the ringing in her ears. The Drummond brothers, all three of them, chose her. What were they thinking? Why her when half the daughters in the territory had been throwing themselves at those men for years? Well, Mrs. Headley recovered her professional demeanor with the determination of a woman who had survived worse surprises. That was highly irregular, but the Drummond family is deeply respected in this community, and their offer was made in proper form. Miss Ellery, if you'll follow me, I'll show you to your accommodations. Pearl caught up with Marin as they descended the platform stairs, grabbing her hand and squeezing with fierce, tearful joy. Oh, Miss Marin, the Drummond brothers. They're the wealthiest family in the territory. Mountain men with 18,000 acres. All three of them standing there like that. Isn't it wonderful? Marin looked at the girl's shining face and felt something crack open in her chest. Not quite hope. Something close to it. Something dangerous and terrifying and utterly necessary. Ask me in a week, she said softly, when I know if it's real, Mrs. Calder's boarding house was a tidy two-story structure on the respectable end of Cutter's Bend's Main Street, its white clapboard siding scrubbed clean and its windows gleaming with the particular shine that spoke of a proprietor who considered dirt a personal enemy and waged war against it with the tireless dedication of a general who refused to accept defeat. The woman herself was compact and 60, with eyes that missed nothing, and the brisk efficiency of a particularly organized hawk surveying her territory from a high perch. "You're the one the Drummond brothers chose," Mrs. Calder said, leading Marin up the narrow stairs. Not a question. In a town this size, news traveled faster than wildfire and dry brush. Yes, ma'am. Surprised everyone, I'd wager, including you. Especially me. Mrs. Calder glanced back over her shoulder, and something that might have been approval flickered across her lined face. Everett Drummond's got good sense when he uses it. Lost his way for a time after Rosalind died, but he steadied back out. All three of them did. You could do far worse, Miss Ellery. Far worse indeed. The room was small but clean. Bed dresser, washstand, a single window overlooking the street below. Simple, but compared to some of the places Marin had stayed during her years of wandering boarding houses, where the sheets smelled of the previous occupants' despair, and the walls were thin enough to hear every private grief on either side, it was practically luxurious. A room of her own with a door that locked and sheets that smelled of lavender soap and a window that looked out on a world that had for the first time in 7 years surprised her. Suppers at 6 sharp, Mrs. Calder continued. 5 other women boarding here currently. 3 already married, waiting for their husbands to finish building homes. The other 2 still in courtship. You'll meet them all at dinner. Any questions? No, ma'am, thank you. Mrs. Does. Calder paused at the door, her hand on the knob, studying Marin with the frank appraisal of a woman who had spent decades reading character in faces and had gotten very good at separating substance from surface. The Drummond brothers are hard men, Miss Ellery. Hard but fair, mountain men through and through. They'll expect a partner, not a servant. Someone who can carry weight, not just follow orders. That ranch sits high and lonely, and winter up there is no place for the faint-hearted. Think you can manage that? I've been managing on my own for 7 years, Mrs. Calder. I think I can manage with help. Good answer. The door closed and Marin was alone. She set her carpet bag on the bed and sat down beside it. Her legs had started shaking, the delayed reaction setting in now that she was safe from watching eyes. She gripped her knees and tried to breathe steadily through the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm the composure she had maintained through sheer force of will since 3 men on horseback had ridden into her life like an answered prayer she had stopped praying. They chose her, the Drummond brothers, the wealthiest, most powerful family in 3 territories. Mountain men who had carved an empire out of wilderness and held it against everything the land could throw at them. 3 men who could have had any woman in Montana who had reportedly been turning down eligible young women for 4 years had walked past every other option on that platform and stopped in front of her. Position number 12 out of 13, the last one standing when every other man had turned away. The one with the worn carpet bag and the dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was more memory than material. Why the question circled like a hawk over open ground. Men like the Drummonds did not choose women like Marin without reason. There was always an angle, always a calculation beneath the surface that made sense of the incomprehensible. She had learned young that nothing good came without a price, and kindness from powerful men was usually a mask for something that looked very different once the mask came off. But the way Everett had looked at her, something that looked impossibly like respect, the kind of respect that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognition. Supper was served in Mrs. Calder's dining room, a cheerful space with yellow curtains and enough seating for a dozen. Marin found herself at a table surrounded by women in varying stages of frontier matrimony, all of them buzzing with news of the day's most dramatic event. Adelaide, a plump and cheerful woman already married and waiting for her husband to finish their homestead, was holding court with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered the most exciting piece of gossip in the territory's history. Elkhorn Ridge Ranch, named for the massive elk antlers mounted above the gate. They say the Drummond horses are the finest in the territory. People come from California just to look at the stock. 35 cowboys working for them year-round. Sarah added, her eyes wide with the particular awe reserved for numbers that exceeded ordinary comprehension. Can you imagine managing a household that size up in the mountains? Rosalind managed it. The quiet voice belonged to Mrs. Yardley, an older woman with sad eyes who sat at the far end of the table with the stillness of someone who carried knowledge she wished she did not possess. The name fell into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples of silence outward until the entire table had gone quiet and every face had turned toward the woman who had spoken it. His first wife, Mrs. Yardley continued, her voice careful and low-weighted, with the particular gravity of someone telling a story that had consequences. Everett's. She died 4 years ago. Complications in childbirth. The baby with her, sure. How awful, Pearl whispered from across the table. They say Everett nearly died himself after, Mrs. Yardley continued. Not physically, in spirit. Locked himself away on that ranch up in the mountains for months. Wouldn't see anyone, wouldn't come down to town, wouldn't speak more than 10 words a day. Beckett and Soren practically ran everything while their brother grieved himself into a ghost. She paused, and when she continued, her voice dropped even lower so that only those leaning in could hear. And everyone was leaning in. There's something else most people don't talk about openly. Rosalind didn't simply die of childbirth complications. The isolation broke her long before that. She was 18 when Everett married her, a city girl from back east, gentle and sheltered. She had no idea what mountain ranch life actually meant. The loneliness of that ridge ate away at her for years, the winters when the road was sealed and she didn't see another woman's face for weeks at a time. She stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping, stopped leaving the house. By the time the baby came, her body had nothing left to fight with. Mrs. Yardley looked directly at Marin, and her eyes held a warning that was also somehow an act of kindness, the kindness of a woman who believed that truth, even painful truth, was better than the alternative. There's a difference between recovering and healing, Miss Ellery. Everett recovered. I don't think he's healed. And whoever becomes his wife will be stepping into the shadow of a woman who couldn't survive that life. Up there on that mountain in that isolation, the whole town will be watching to see if you can do what Rosalind couldn't. The words settled into Marin's chest like stones dropped into deep water, sinking past the tentative warmth of the afternoon's impossible events, past the fragile, almost hope that had begun to take root, settling into the cold, dark place where Marin kept all the truths she did not want to look at directly, but could not afford to ignore. She was not just entering a courtship, she was entering a ghost story. That night, alone in her room, Marin lay in the unfamiliar bed and listened to the boarding house settle into silence around her. Footsteps in the hallway fading, low voices dropping to whispers. The ordinary sounds of other people's lives moving forward, while hers hung suspended between what had been and what might be, between the woman who had walked toward the stairs and the woman who had turned around when thunder shook the world. Through the window, moonlight painted silver squares on the wooden floor. Marin watched them shift and thought about Rosalind Drummond, 18 years old, city girl, carried into the mountains by love or hope, or the same desperation that had put Marin on 7 platforms and broken by isolation and silence, until there was nothing left of her but a body too exhausted to survive the one thing it was supposed to do naturally. A cautionary tale written in the language of loneliness and loss, and Marin was being asked to write the next chapter. And Marin thought about the 3 men who had looked at her on that platform and seen something worth choosing. What exactly had they seen? A desperate woman willing to accept any offer? A practical solution to a domestic problem? Or had they seen what Marin herself was no longer sure existed? A woman with enough spine and sense to build something real in a place that had already destroyed one woman who tried. She thought about packing her bag and slipping away before dawn, before the hope could grow roots, before it could become something strong enough to hurt her when it was inevitably ripped away. But she did not pack. Instead, as exhaustion pulled her towards sleep, Marin Ellery allowed herself one small dangerous thought. The thought she had forbidden herself for 3 years since the night in Cheyenne, when she had decided that wanting things was a form of self-destruction, and that the only safe way to live was to expect nothing and be grateful for anything above nothing. What if this time was different? What if after 7 rejections, the 8th time was the one that held? What if 22 was not too old and small was not too small, and all the broken pieces of her life could somehow be assembled into something whole? The thought terrified her more than any rejection ever had, because rejection she knew how to survive. She had the calluses to prove it, 7 layers thick, built up over 7 platforms in 7 towns. But hope could destroy her completely. Marin closed her eyes and let sleep take her, not knowing if she was falling towards something wonderful or something that would break her beyond all repair. Tomorrow at 8, 3 men with amber eyes and an 18,000-acre ranch in the mountains would walk back into her life and either confirm or demolish the most dangerous feeling she had allowed herself in years. Tomorrow everything would begin, or everything would end, and lying there in the moonlit dark of Mrs. Calder's boarding house, Marin Ellery was not sure which possibility frightened her more. Morning arrived with the ruthless efficiency of a frontier dawn, sunlight cutting through Marin's window like a blade, dragging her from fitful dreams into the sharp-edged reality of what this day meant. She had slept in fragments, waking every hour to check the small clock on the dresser, watching time crawl toward 8, with the inevitability of water running downhill, each minute heavier than the last. By 6, she had given up on sleep entirely. By 7, she had washed, dressed in her best day clothes, a gray cotton dress with a modest white collar that had seen better years, but was clean and carefully pressed, and pinned her hair 3 different ways before settling on the simple bun that made her look competent rather than decorative. Her hands shook as she worked the pins, and she hated the trembling, hated the vulnerability it revealed. She had spent 7 years building walls against exactly this kind of exposure, and now those walls were developing cracks she could not seal fast enough. "You look lovely," Pearl said from the doorway, making Marin jump. The girl was already dressed pink-cheeked and luminous, with the particular glow that came from believing the future held only good things. Her farmer Burris was calling at 10 to show her the homestead. She practically vibrated with the anticipation, her whole body humming with the energy of someone standing on the edge of the life she had prayed for. "I look presentable," Marin corrected, turning from the mirror. "There's a difference." "Oh, but the way they rode in yesterday, all three of those, all that dust and those horses, and they walked straight to you, like they could see you through the crowd, like you were the only person standing on that whole platform. Isn't it the most romantic thing you've ever seen, Pearl?" Marin kept her voice gentle but firm, the way a teacher speaks to a student who is reaching a conclusion that the evidence does not support. "Please don't build fairy tales around this. It's a practical arrangement between practical people, nothing more." The girl's face fell slightly, but rallied with the resilience of youth, the extraordinary ability of the young to absorb disappointment and immediately begin rebuilding hope on its ruins. "Maybe it starts practical and becomes something more. My mother always said love that grows slow lasts longer than love that burns fast." Before Marin could respond, Mrs. Calder's voice carried up the stairwell with the penetrating authority of a woman accustomed to being heard through walls and across distances. "Miss Ellery, gentlemen callers in the parlor." 7:45. They were early, all three of them apparently. Marin's stomach clenched like a fist closing around something fragile. She pressed one hand against her midsection, willing the nerves to settle, then straightened her spine and lifted her chin. Whatever happened in the next hour, she would face it directly. She had survived worse than conversation. She had survived silence, which was harder. The parlor was Mrs. Calder's pride, lace curtains filtering the morning light into something soft and forgiving. Upholstered furniture that had survived better decades but maintained its dignity through careful repair. A vase of wildflowers on the side table making a brave attempt at cheer against the weight of what this room was about to witness. And standing in this delicate feminine space looking as out of place as three wolves in a millinery shop were the Drummond brothers. They had cleaned up since yesterday. The trail dust was gone, replaced by dark trousers, crisp white shirts, and leather vests that did nothing to diminish the sheer physical presence of three men who had been shaped by years of brutal mountain labor into something that ordinary rooms could barely contain. Everett stood by the window, hat in his hands, the morning light catching the scar through his eyebrow and turning it silver. Beckett leaned against the mantel, arms crossed, his face carrying the cool, analytical composure of a man who approached every situation as a problem to be solved. Soren occupied the doorway to the kitchen, one shoulder against the frame, the most relaxed of the three, but his eyes just as watchful, just as attentive, the warmth in his expression doing nothing to diminish the intelligence behind it. Mrs. Calder had positioned herself in the hallway close enough to satisfy the requirements of propriety, far enough to allow genuine conversation. A good chaperone, a smart one, the kind who understood that the space between too close and too far was where real decisions were made. "Miss Ellery." Everett nodded as Marin entered, a gesture of respect that still felt foreign coming from a man addressing her, still carried the faint shock of the unexpected. "Mr. Drummond." "Everett," he corrected, and the use of his given name was itself a kind of offering, a lowering of formality that created space for something more honest. "If we're courting with intent to marry, you should call me Everett. These are Beckett and Soren. No misters. We don't stand on ceremony." Marin moved into the room, hyper-aware of how small she felt among them, how the space that had seemed adequate 5 minutes ago now felt crowded with male presence and the complicated energy of three brothers who moved through the world as a single unit. She sat in the chair Everett indicated, folding her hands in her lap to keep them still, arranging her face into the composure that had carried her through 7 platforms and would carry her through this too, whatever this turned out to be. Everett took the seat across from her. Beckett remained standing at the mantel, a position that allowed him to observe everything without being the center of attention. Soren stayed in the doorway, his posture casual, but his attention absolute, watching Marin with eyes that seemed to be cataloging not just what she said, but how she said it, not just her words, but the spaces between them. For a moment's silence, not hostile, not comfortable. The silence of careful people trying to determine how to begin a conversation that might change everything, that might reshape 4 lives and either build something lasting or reveal that the foundation was sand. "I appreciate your directness yesterday," Everett said finally. "Most women would have prettied up the truth, added years to their experience or subtracted years from their age. You didn't. Didn't seem much point. No." Something that might have been approval crossed his face quick as a shadow moving across stone. "I value honesty. In business, in friendship, and especially in marriage. So I'm going to be direct with you now, and I'd appreciate the same in return." "Go ahead." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped between them. The posture of a man preparing to lay down cards he had been holding close for a long time, cards that cost something to reveal. "I'm 34 years old. Built Elkhorn Ridge from nothing. Started with 500 acres and 24 cattle 15 years ago, when I was 19 and too young to know what impossible meant. Worked myself half to death, turning it into what it is now. 18,000 acres up in the mountains in a valley most people said couldn't support a ranch at all. I'm proud of what I've accomplished, but I'm realistic about what it might." He paused, and Marin watched something move behind his eyes, something old and heavy that he carried the way a man carries a wound that healed wrong and aches in certain weather. "My first wife, Rosalind, was 18 when we married. Sweet girl, good-hearted, loved music and books and the idea of wide open spaces. But she was a city girl from back east, and she wasn't prepared for what mountain ranching actually meant. The isolation up there, the winters when the road seals and you don't see another soul outside the ranch for weeks. It broke something in her long before the childbirth complications that killed her." Marin heard Mrs. Calder shift in the hallway, the small sound of a woman who knew this story and felt its weight. She kept her eyes on Everett's face. This was not romantic courtship talk. This was not the polished performance of a man trying to impress. This was something raw, more honest, more important. This was a man showing her the worst of what he had to offer so that she could make her decision with open eyes. "I'm not looking to repeat that mistake." Everett continued, his voice steady, but carrying the undercurrent of a man who had spent 4 years learning to speak about things that had nearly destroyed him. "I don't need a girl who thinks mountain ranch life is an adventure she can quit when it gets hard. I need a woman who understands that it's work. Lonely sometimes, brutal in winter. Nothing like stories in ladies' magazines. Someone who won't resent me when reality doesn't match expectation." Beckett spoke from the mantel, his voice carrying the precise, analytical quality that seemed to be his natural register. "The ranch is a business, Marin. 35 men on payroll year-round, more during roundup and branding. Supply chains that run up and down a mountain road that washes out in spring and closes in winter. Payroll calculations, seasonal budgets, inventory management. Everett handles the cattle and land. I handle the money and commerce. Soren handles the horses and the men. But we need someone to manage the household operations, the books that don't involve cattle, and the logistics of feeding and maintaining a crew that size in conditions most people would consider impossible." "I kept books for my father's general store for 3 years," Marin said, and her voice found its footing as it moved onto ground. She knew ground she had earned the right to stand on through competence rather than appearance. "Managed accounts, tracked inventory, negotiated with the suppliers when he was too sick to do it himself. I've cooked for church suppers, feeding 50 people with ingredients that had to stretch further than they should have. I'm not afraid of numbers or hard work. The Soren pushed off the doorframe and moved into the room, dropping into a chair with the loose-limbed ease of a man comfortable in any space, a man who carried his home inside himself. I've got a different question. Can you laugh? Because these two are serious enough for the whole territory. And if I have to spend the rest of my life on that mountain with nothing but grim faces across the dinner table, I might ride off into the high country and never come back. Despite everything, despite the nerves and the gravity of the situation, and the weight of 7 years of rejection pressing on her chest like a stone, Marin felt the corner of her mouth twitch, an involuntary response, the kind that could not be faked or performed. I've been told my sense of humor is too sharp for polite company. Perfect, Soren said, and the grin that spread across his face was like sunlight breaking through clouds. Polite company is boring. Then Marin did something that women in these situations did not typically do. Women standing on the receiving end of salvation did not typically question the hands reaching down to pull them up. They accepted gratefully and asked nothing that might jeopardize the offer. But Marin was not most women, and gratitude without understanding was just another form of helplessness, just another way of handing control to someone else and hoping they used it well. Why now? She asked, and the directness of her question made all three brothers register surprise, a flicker of recalculation crossing three identical faces. You've been alone 4 years. Women have been available. I've heard that half the families in this territory have tried to match you with their daughters. Why choose from a bride platform? Why choose someone like me? Everett was quiet for a moment, the silence of a man considering how much truth to reveal and deciding as he apparently decided about everything in favor of all of it. Hap Mercer, our foreman, has been telling me for 2 years the ranch needs a woman's presence, that we're getting too set in solitary ways, too hardened, too accustomed to living without anyone to remind us that life is supposed to include more than work and then sleep and more work. I resisted because I didn't want to court some young thing looking for romance and excitement and a wealthy husband who'd take her to dances. Then Hap suggested the platform. Figured women coming out here through the society knew what frontier life actually meant. Realistic expectations. And you were late, Marin said. Trail slide blocked the pass. By the time we got word and rode through the night, I figured we'd missed everything. Maybe that was better. Let the men looking for pretty young brides make their choices first. Left behind women who'd already proven they could handle disappointment. Women who were still standing after the world had given them every reason to sit down. The logic was cold. Marin felt it land in her chest like a chip of ice, sharp-edged and clarifying. So you chose me because I've failed repeatedly. The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with old pain that she had not packed away deeply enough that had surfaced before she could push it back down. I chose you because you survived failing repeatedly. Everett corrected, and his voice carried no defensiveness, only the quiet certainty of a man stating something he believed to be fundamentally true. There's a difference. That ranch up on the mountain will test you. Weather that tries to kill you 6 months of the year. Isolation that makes strong people question their own sanity. Work that never ends, and disappointments that pile up until you can't see over them. I need someone who doesn't fold at the first difficulty, or the 5th, or the 20th. Your history says you don't fold. It was the strangest compliment Marin had ever received. Not you are pretty, not you seem pleasant, not you have a lovely smile, but you don't fold. As if resilient was worth more than a soft face or an agreeable disposition. As if the very thing that had made her unmarketable on 7 platforms was exactly what made her valuable to these 3 men. As if surviving was itself a form of beauty that only certain eyes could see. What exactly would you expect from a wife, she asked. Partnership. The word came from all 3 of them simultaneously, and the synchronization was so precise that it startled even Mrs. Calder in the hallway. Everett continued without acknowledging the phenomenon, as if three voices speaking one word at the same time was so ordinary it required no comment. Someone to help run the household, manage supplies, keep the books. Someone who will speak her mind, tell me when I'm being a fool, and pull her weight as an equal. Not behind me, beside me. Then I have a condition, Marin said, and she watched all three brothers go still with attention, the kind of stillness that predators achieve when something in the landscape changes, not hostile, but absolutely focused. I've been desperate before. I've made bad choices because desperation makes you grab at anything that looks like salvation without checking whether it's solid or just painted to look that way. I don't want to do that again. I want to make a clear-headed decision about whether we genuinely suit each other, not based on whether this is my last chance, not based on whether I should be grateful someone finally chose me, based on whether we can actually build something real together. That's fair, Everett said slowly, and the respect in his voice was unmistakable, the genuine article not performed or calculated, but earned in real time. That's smart. Then what do you need from us this week to make that decision? Beckett asked, and the question itself was a form of respect, an acknowledgement that her decision mattered as much as theirs. Honesty about your life, your expectations, your temperaments, and time to see whether I can actually manage what you're asking me to manage. Done, Everett said. Tomorrow you'll come to the ranch, up the mountain, spend the day, see the work, meet the men. If it's not what you can handle, better to know now than after vows are spoken. And if I decide it's not right, Everett met her eyes with a steadiness that left no room for doubt, no space for the kind of ambiguity that powerful men sometimes used as a weapon. Then we shake hands, wish you well, and you go on your way with no hard feelings and no obligations. I'm not interested in trapping anyone in a life they'll come to hate. Done that once, the cost was too high. They walked Cutter's Bend's main street afterward, Mrs. Calder trailing 10 paces behind, with the practiced discretion of a professional chaperone. The morning was warming into the kind of crisp autumn day that made the sky impossibly blue, the air sharp with wood smoke, and the distant mineral scent of mountains that were already showing their first caps of early snow. And every single person they passed stopped to stare. Marin felt the weight of their eyes like small stones hitting exposed skin, heard whispers spreading like ripples across a pond. There go the Drummond brothers with that woman, the one nobody picked. What in heaven's name are they thinking? She kept her spine straight and her expression neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort, refusing to shrink under the collective judgment of people who had formed their opinions about her worth before she had spoken a single word. Ignore them, Everett said quietly, and she realized he had moved so that she walked on the inside, sheltered between him and the buildings, while Beckett and Soren flanked them on the street side. Three large men forming a barrier between her and the staring world, without any of them acknowledging the formation, without any of them making it a declaration. Just a quiet repositioning, a shifting of bodies that said more about these men than any speech could have. At the general store, Everett spoke to the proprietor with the easy authority of a man whose business was valued. "Morning, Patterson. This is Marin Ellery. We're courting. Need to get her outfitted. Good walking boots, work gloves, riding clothes, and a proper hat. Sun and wind up on the ridge will eat her alive without one." "Riding clothes?" Marin asked. "Ranch is 15 miles from town, up a mountain trail. You'll need to ride, and you'll need to ride well enough to handle switchbacks and loose rock." Marin watched the pile of goods grow on the counter. Sturdy boots of soft, well-made leather, work gloves that would protect without restricting movement, a wide-brimmed hat built for weather, not fashion, a heavy coat for the winter that was already sharpening its teeth in the passes above. Each item practical, functional, chosen with the experienced eye of men who understood exactly what mountain country demanded of the people who tried to live in it. "I can't let you buy all this before we've even decided." Marin protested the independent streak that had kept her alive for 7 years, rebelling against accepting so much from men she had known less than a day. Consider it an investment, Everett said. Whether you marry us or not, you'll need proper gear for ranch visits this week. Practical, not personal. She tried on the boots. They fit perfectly soft leather molding to her feet as though they had been waiting for her, as though among all the boots in Montana territory, these particular ones had been made for these particular feet. She laced them up and stood testing the feel and caught Soren watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Not assessment, something warmer. Something that suggested he was pleased she was still here, still trying, still willing to see what came next instead of running from it. The next morning, Marin rode to Elkhorn Ridge Ranch for the first time. Soren had brought 4 horses down his brother's mounts, and a smaller chestnut mare with gentle dark eyes and a temperament so even that Marin understood immediately she had been chosen with care, selected not for speed or strength, but for patience, for the willingness to carry an uncertain rider without judgment. "This is Birdie," Soren said, holding the mare steady while Marin approached. "Good-tempered, forgiving, steady on rough ground. Best horse for someone getting back into riding. And she knows the mountain trail better than most of the men." Mounting was awkward. Muscles she had not used in years protested positions they barely remembered, and her body felt clumsy and uncertain in the saddle foreign to itself. But Soren was patient, adjusting stirrups and offering quiet instruction with the calm, unhurried competence of a man who had spent his life working with animals and understood that trust could not be rushed. They started at a walk, and almost immediately the terrain began to change. This was not the flat prairie Marin had expected. The trail climbed winding through stands of pine and spruce, crossing small streams over rocks worn smooth by centuries of water. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation, carrying the clean, sharp scent of mountain forests of earth and stone and the ancient cold that lived above the tree line. Cutter's Bend fell away behind them, growing small and then smaller, and then disappearing entirely, swallowed by the folds of the land as if it had never existed. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Soren asked, watching her face with the attention of a man who wanted to see truth rather than performance. "Terrifying," Marin answered honestly. "So much space, so much height. A person could get lost up here and never be found. Or a person could finally have room to breathe. Depends on whether you see the space as something that swallows you or something that sets you free." They rode for an hour, Marin's muscles screaming protest, but her stubbornness refusing to acknowledge the pain, refusing to give her body the satisfaction of defeating her will. Everett pointed out landmarks from the Saddle Creek beds that ran with snowmelt in spring property boundaries marked by ancient trees and rock formations that had been old when the first humans walked this land. Beckett explained the economic geography with the precision of a man who saw landscape in terms of systems, which meadows produced the best grazing, where water rights began and ended, how the mountain elevation created microclimates that could mean the difference between a profitable year and a devastating one. Then the ranch complex appeared as they crested a final rise, and Marin's breath caught in her throat like something physical, something that could be held and examined. It sprawled across the valley floor like a small civilization. A large 2-story house painted white with green shutters, solid and well-built, anchored to the earth with the permanence of something that intended to outlast the people who built it. Barns and corrals and bunkhouses and storage sheds. An entire community organized around the business of raising cattle and horses in country that most people would have called impossible. But what made it different from every other ranch Marin had seen or imagined was the setting. Mountains rose on 3 sides, their peaks already white with early snow, creating a natural amphitheater that was simultaneously protective and isolating. The valley was beautiful, stunning, and utterly, completely remote. This was not a ranch near a town. This was a world unto itself, accessible only by the trail they had just climbed, a trail that winter would seal shut for weeks at a time. "That's home," Everett said simply. "Home." The word hit Marin with a force she had not anticipated. When had she last had something she could call home? Not since her father died and creditors took everything in the store and the house and every object that had ever carried the weight of belonging. 7 years of temporary rooms and borrowed spaces and the constant grinding awareness that she belonged nowhere and to no one. At the ranch yard, a bow-legged man in his 50s approached Blue Eyes, assessing Marin in one sweeping glance that took in everything from her new boots to the set of her jaw. Hap Mercer, the foreman. 15 years at Everett's side through blizzards and droughts and the particular devastation of watching his employer nearly destroy himself with grief. The kind of man whose opinion was earned through decades of loyalty, not given as a courtesy. So this is her, Hap said, his voice carrying the dry, economical quality of a man who did not waste words. Then to Marin, with the directness of someone who had no use for social niceties, "You cook, yes. Good. Cookie's been threatening to quit if someone doesn't improve the spice situation. Says he's tired of men complaining that his food tastes like boiled boot leather." He turned to Everett. "She'll do." The kitchen was the real test. Cookie, whose given name was Earl, but who would respond to nothing else, and had been known to ignore people who used his Christian name until they learned better, was 63 years old, permanently scowling, and ran his domain with the iron discipline of a military quartermaster. He looked Marin up and down with eyes that had been evaluating people for longer than she had been alive, handed her an apron without ceremony, and delivered his verdict before she had tied it on. "Make biscuits, enough for 35 men. Prove you're not all talk and pretty boots." Marin rolled up her sleeves and went to work. Her hands found the rhythm of dough before her conscious mind caught up muscle memory, older than her failures, older than the platform, older than the grief. Patterns learned at her mother's side before her mother died. Refined in her father's kitchen when cooking became not just a skill, but a survival mechanism. She mixed and shaped with quick efficiency, while Cookie watched every movement with the unblinking focus of a man who had spent his life judging people by what they did rather than what they said. When the biscuits came out of the oven, golden and flaky, and filling the kitchen with a smell that drew two cowboys to the doorway, ice like moths to lamplight, Cookie took one with deliberate ceremony. He broke it open, examined the interior with the focus of a jeweler inspecting a stone for flaws, tasted it with the grave consideration of a man rendering a judgment that would not be appealed. His scowl did not change. It would never change. That scowl was as permanent as the mountains outside the window. But he nodded once, a single vertical movement of his head that carried the weight of professional endorsement. "You'll do. Can you manage stew for 35? Tell me what you have. I'll manage it." They worked side by side through the morning, Cookie barking instructions while Marin chopped, stirred, seasoned, and absorbed. Cooking for 35 hungry cowboys was nothing like cooking for a church supper. The quantities were staggering, measured not in cups and teaspoons, but in pounds and gallons. The pace was relentless, a continuous cycle of preparation that began before dawn and would not end until the last plate was cleared after the evening meal, and the margin for error was measured in the grumbling of men who had been working hard physical labor since before sunrise and wanted their food hot, plentiful, and exactly right. But Marin found something in that kitchen she had not expected. Something she had not known she was missing until she stumbled upon it between the flour bin and the stove. Purpose, the tangible, immediate satisfaction of doing necessary work and seeing results. Men would eat because of her effort. They would be fed and strengthened and able to continue the brutal physical labor that kept this mountain ranch alive. There was meaning in that. There was worth. Not the kind of worth that showed up on registration forms or was measured by the standards of men shopping for wives on platforms. The real kind. The kind that filled the hollow places. At noon, the hands came in. 35 cowboys crowding into the long dining hall, filling it with noise and the smell of horses and honest sweat and mountain air. Marin served alongside cookie ladling stew into bowls, distributing biscuits, refilling coffee, with the efficient movements of a woman who was discovering that she was built for this kind of work. The men were polite, most of them. Curious, all of them. A few openly skeptical, watching her with the particular wariness of men who had been doing fine without a woman's interference and were not entirely convinced they needed one now. But when they tasted the food, skepticism gave way to the universal language of men who were eating well and knew it, the satisfied silence that was itself the highest compliment a ranch kitchen could receive. Everett sat at the head of the table watching Marin move through the room with an attention that he probably thought was discreet, but that Marin could feel on her skin like warmth from a distant fire. When she came to refill his coffee, he caught her wrist, gently holding her there for a moment that existed outside the normal flow of time. "You're doing well," he said low enough for only her to hear. "It's just cooking. It's more than that. Look at them." He nodded toward the hands who were relaxed and talking freely, several reaching for second helpings with the uncomplicated pleasure of men who had forgotten what it felt like to look forward to a meal. They're comfortable. That matters more than you know. Men work better when the place they come back to feels like someone cares whether they eat well or not. Then in the early afternoon, with Marin bent over ledgers in Beckett's office, learning the architecture of the ranch's finances, two arrivals shattered the day's careful rhythm like stones thrown through glass. The first came by carriage, a polished, expensive carriage that looked absurdly out of place in a mountain ranch yard, its lacquered surfaces collecting dust from the trail like an insult to its own elegance. The woman who stepped down from it was 21 years old, dark-haired and blue-eyed, wearing a silk dress the color of spring sky that probably cost more than Marin had earned in 3 years combined. She carried a basket of baked goods in a smile that was equal parts sugar and calculation, the kind of smile that had been practiced in mirrors until it achieved exactly the desired effect. Veda Hargrove, niece of Nella Mercer. The woman Hap's wife had been trying to place in the Drummond household for 2 solid years, and she moved through the ranch with the easy familiarity of someone who had been here many times before, greeting cowboys by name, knowing which stall held, which horse, navigating the property with a confidence that made Marin, in her new boots and borrowed apron, feel like an imposter caught wearing someone else's life. "Oh," Veda said, stopping in the kitchen doorway where Marin was cleaning up from the noon meal. Her blue eyes performed a rapid inventory of Marin's appearance, cataloging the flour-dusted apron, the hair escaping its pins in the kitchen, heat the plain gray dress beneath. The assessment took less than 3 seconds and was more thorough than any evaluation Marin had endured on any platform. "You must be the bride from the platform. How very unexpected." The word was delivered with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and Marin understood immediately what she was facing. Not open hostility, which could be confronted and defeated. Something more dangerous. The polished, well-bred cruelty of a woman who had been raised to destroy rivals with courtesy, to deliver wounds so precisely wrapped in pleasantry that the bleeding started before you realized you had been cut. Before Marin could formulate a response, the second arrival announced itself. Hoofbeats in the yard, a single rider on a fine horse, and suddenly the energy on the ranch shifted like weather changing on a mountain, going from calm to charged in the space between one breath and the next. Nolan Creed dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who did everything with deliberate grace, who had cultivated elegance as a tool the way other men cultivated strength. He was 38, handsome in the particular way of men who had never done a day of physical labor, but had the money to maintain the appearance of vitality. Well-dressed, well-spoken, well-groomed, he smiled at everyone he saw, and the smile never quite settled anywhere, never quite convinced, like a mask worn so long it had become indistinguishable from the face beneath. He had come, he said, to discuss business, something about shared trail access to the lower valley. But his timing arriving on the same day, Marin was visiting on the same afternoon, Veda Hargrove had appeared with her basket, and her calculated smile felt less like coincidence and more like choreography. Marin watched from the kitchen doorway as the conversation played out in the yard. Everett stood with his arms crossed, his face showing nothing but the granite patience of a man who had heard many propositions and found most of them wanting. Beckett stood beside him, his analytical eyes cataloging every word Creed spoke with the attention of a man who parsed language for hidden meaning, the way an assayer parsed ore for hidden gold. Soren leaned against the corral fence with the deceptive casualness of a man who could move very fast if circumstances required. Simply proposing a more cooperative arrangement for trail access, Creed said, his voice carrying the smooth, reasonable tone of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through persuasion rather than force. No reason we can't be good neighbors. We've been good neighbors for 15 years without your help, Everett said flatly. Times change. Creed's expression registered regret that was about as genuine as a $3 bill. Then his eyes found Marin in the doorway and something shifted in his face. A flicker of interest, of opportunity identified and cataloged with the quick precision of a man who saw every person as a piece on a board. He removed his hat and inclined his head in a gesture of such polished courtesy that it made the Drummond brothers' straightforward manner seem almost crude by comparison. Nolan Creed, I own the spread east of here, down in the lower valley. I don't believe we've been introduced. Marin Ellery. Ah, the bride everyone's discussing. I must say the Drummond brothers have excellent taste. If you ever find yourself in need of anything, Miss Ellery, anything at all that three busy ranchers might not have time to provide, conversation perhaps, company during the long winters up here, my door is always open. We're neighbors after all. Everett stepped between them, not aggressively, not dramatically. But the movement carried the unmistakable message of a man drawing a line in the dirt that he would defend. She doesn't need anything from you, Creed. Creed smiled that sliding smile, tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away at an easy trot that somehow managed to convey contempt for everything it passed. After both visitors had gone, Veda departing in her expensive carriage with a wave and a promise to call again soon that sounded more like a warning than a courtesy, Beckett pulled Marin aside in the office. His voice, stripped of its usual sardonic edge, carried a weight that made her pay close attention. Creed is not the kind of dangerous that uses guns or fists. He uses influence, social pressure, whisper campaigns. He doesn't want our land. He wants something harder to defend. He wants to break the unity between the three of us. A single Drummond is easier to deal with than three Drummonds standing together. He's been looking for a wedge for years. And now he knows about me, Marin said. Now he knows about you, which gives him something new to work with. Not through violence. Creed is too clever for that. Through charm, through the appearance of kindness, through making Everett react with his heart instead of his head. She understood then what Beckett was telling her, not just about Creed's tactics, but about the role she was stepping into. She was not just a potential wife. She was a piece on a board that was already in play, and the game had stakes that went far beyond domestic arrangements. Sunday brought the test Marin had been dreading. Church. The entire community gathered in one place, every eye and every opinion focused with devastating precision on the woman the Drummond brothers had inexplicably chosen from the bottom of the barrel. She dressed in her best dark green cotton with black trim and pinned her hair with hands that trembled despite her commands to be still. The brothers arrived at 9. 3 men in dark suits who looked like they had been carved from the same mountain, escorting a woman who barely reached their shoulders through the church doors and into the full devastating weight of Cutter's Bend's assembled judgment. The whispers started before they reached their pew. Marin caught fragments that hit like small stones thrown with precision by hands that could not be seen, plain as a fence post. What can he possibly see in her? Rosalind must be turning in her. She sat between Everett and Soren, spine straight, face forward, hands folded in her lap, enduring the way she had learned to endure everything by being still and letting it pass through her rather than trying to stop it. The community dinner afterward was worse. Tables set under oak trees, women laying out food, children running between adults, and every conversation that stopped. When Marin walked past every cluster of women who fell silent and then resumed whispering after she had gone by. Nella Mercer appeared like a storm that had been gathering strength for days and had finally decided to make landfall. She was perhaps 45, handsome in a hard way, wearing her best dress like armor and her indignation like a crown. Hap's wife, Veda's aunt, a woman who had invested 2 years of careful social maneuvering in placing her niece in the Drummond household and was not prepared to accept the loss without a fight. Miss Ellery, how fascinating to finally meet you properly. The whole town has been simply consumed with curiosity. You really must tell me how you managed to capture the attention of all three Drummond brothers when so many truly lovely young women have hoped for years. Marin saw it coming the way you see weather building on a mountain horizon, inevitable and getting closer and impossible to avoid. Before she could respond, before she could summon the diplomatic deflection she had been rehearsing in her mind, three voices hit the air in rapid succession. Everett first, his voice low and edged like a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. I chose a woman, Nella, not a girl playing at frontier life. I chose someone with spine enough to build a real partnership. Beckett next cold as creek water in January, each word placed with the precision of a man who understood that language could cut deeper than any knife. Any disrespect toward Marin will be treated as disrespect toward this family. I'd suggest considering that carefully before speaking again. And Soren, whose warmth had vanished so completely, it was as if a different man stood in his place, his voice carrying a quiet menace that was more alarming than any shout, because it suggested depths that were usually kept hidden. Veda is a fine girl, Nella, but we didn't choose her. We chose Marin. That's the end of it. The silence that followed was so complete, Marin could hear a child laughing on the other side of the churchyard, oblivious to the drama that had just played out beneath the oaks. Nolan Creed had appeared at church. Of course, he had dressed impeccably, working the crowd with practiced charm. When the brothers were pulled into conversation about territorial politics, leaving Marin momentarily alone, Creed materialized at her elbow with a glass of lemonade and a solicitous expression that was crafted to look like genuine concern. It can be lonely settling into a new community, he said, his voice pitched to the intimate register of shared confidence, especially one up on a mountain. If you ever need conversation with someone who appreciates intelligence, my door is always open. Marin watched Everett notice from across the yard, watched his jaw tighten, watched something dark and unfamiliar move through his amber eyes. She recognized it because she had not expected to see it on the face of a man who had presented their entire arrangement as purely practical. Practical men did not get jealous. Men who were beginning to feel something deeper did. That night, Marin packed her carpet bag. She did it quickly, efficiently, with the practiced motions of a woman who had packed and unpacked that bag more times than she could count. Dress, spare underclothes, the worn book she had carried through 6 cities, hairpins, the $17 that now seemed like a lifeline rather than a reminder of poverty. She sat on the bed and wrote a letter, short, honest, devastating in its simplicity. She thanked the Drummond brothers for their offer, explained that she had reached the conclusion that her presence would be a liability rather than an asset, that the community's reaction made it clear she would be a source of embarrassment, a constant target for scrutiny that would reflect poorly on the Drummond name, that they deserved better than what she could give them, better than a woman who had been rejected 7 times by every standard the world recognized. She was sealing the envelope when Pearl appeared in the doorway. The girl took one look at the packed bag, the sealed letter, the set of Marin's jaw, and her face crumbled like a wall that had been holding back something too large to contain. You're leaving. Oh, Miss Marin, no, you can't. Not after everything. I'm making it harder for them, Pearl. Every time someone whispers, every time someone questions their judgment, I'm the cause. They chose me out of some notion that resilience is enough. But resilience doesn't stop people from talking. Resilience doesn't make me beautiful or young or from a good family. Stop it. Pearl's voice cracked with fierce, trembling authority that seemed borrowed from someone much older, from some future version of herself that she was reaching forward in time to access. Just stop it. I watched you on that platform, Miss Marin, when everyone was being chosen except you, when man after man walked right past you like you weren't even there. You stood. You didn't cry. You didn't beg. You didn't make yourself small or look at the ground or apologize for taking up space. You stood there like you deserved to be there as much as anyone. And you did. You do. The words hit Marin in a place she had thought was armored, a place so deep she had forgotten it was vulnerable. Her throat tightened. Her eyes burned. She said nothing because there was nothing to say that would not come out broken. Then a sound from below, small, sharp, the distinctive ping of a pebble striking glass. Marin went to the window. Soren Drummond stood in the yard below, bathed in moonlight, hatless, his auburn hair silver-edged in the pale light. He should not have been there. He had ridden 15 miles down a mountain trail in the dark to stand in this yard. The rules of courtship, the requirements of chaperonage, the expectations of propriety, all of them forbade a man appearing beneath an unmarried woman's window at this hour. But there he stood, looking up at her with eyes that caught the moonlight and held it like whiskey in a glass tilted toward a flame. Hap's wife told Hap, "You look like you were about to run," Soren said, his voice pitched low enough to be private but loud enough to reach her window. "Hap told us, so here I am, 15 miles in the dark because a stubborn woman doesn't know what she's worth. You shouldn't be here." "Probably not. You planning to leave?" Marin's fingers tightened on the letter in her hand. "I'll only make things harder for you, for all three of you. You let us decide what's hard for us. Everyone in that town thinks I'm not good enough. They're probably right. Everyone in that town said this mountain couldn't support a ranch when we first staked our claim 15 years ago. Said three boys barely old enough to shave were out of their minds trying to run cattle in country that God made for elk and nothing else. Now those same people buy our beef and ride our horses and tip their hats when we walk past. We don't take our cues from everyone, Marin. We trust what we see with our own eyes." Silence. The night air carried the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in town, the creek murmuring in the darkness, the ordinary sounds of a world that kept turning regardless of one woman's crisis of faith. Then Soren's voice came again, softer now, carrying something that the daylight version of himself kept carefully hidden beneath humor and easy charm, something raw and undefended that he was choosing to reveal because the moment required it. "Everett is sitting on the front porch right now, up on the mountain, hasn't moved in 2 hours, just staring down toward town like he can see through 15 miles of mountain if he looks hard enough. Beckett checked the account ledgers 3 times tonight. He only does that when something's eating at him so bad he needs numbers to hold on to. And I'm standing in a boarding house yard throwing rocks at a window like I'm 15 years old and trying to get a girl's attention at a barn dance." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with something that had nothing to do with the cold, gnawed air. "You want to tell me that 3 men who've been taking care of themselves just fine for 34 years are all acting like fools tonight because you don't matter, because you're not worth the trouble of riding 15 miles down a mountain in the dark?" Marin looked down at the letter in her hand, the letter that said thank you and goodbye, and I'm not enough. The letter that was safe, that was familiar, that followed the script she had memorized over 7 platforms in 7 towns. Pack the bag, write the note, catch the train, start over, keep moving. Never stay long enough for hope to take root because roots could be ripped up, and that was the worst pain of all. She tore the letter in half, then in quarters. Let the pieces fall from the window like pale moths in the moonlight drifting down through the silver air. "I'll be here in the morning," she said. "Good." Soren touched an invisible hat brim, that familiar gesture of respect, and vanished into the darkness with the silent efficiency of a man who had spent his life moving through mountain country where noise could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. The days that followed compressed into a blur of work and revelation and the so terrifying business of learning to belong somewhere after 7 years of belonging nowhere. On the fourth day, Marin returned to the ranch and worked Cookie's kitchen from dawn until the noon meal was cleared. A young cowboy named Griffith, barely 20, tested her authority with the casual arrogance of a man who had never reported to a woman and did not intend to start. He refused to wash his hands before sitting down to eat, announcing to the table at large that he didn't take orders from females, that he'd been washing or not washing his hands according to his own judgment for 20 years and wasn't about to change on account of some mail-order bride who had been here 5 minutes. Marin did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to higher authority. She did not look toward the door where she could feel Everett watching. She simply said in a tone as level and unforgiving as the Montana plains, "You're not taking orders from me, then. You're following hygiene rules that exist because 35 men sharing a dining table means one person's filth becomes everyone's sickness. Clean hands at this table, or you cook your own meals out on the range. Your choice. Make it now." 34 cowboys went silent. Griffith looked around for support, found 34 pairs of eyes looking elsewhere, and washed his hands at the pump with the sullen compliance of a man who had just learned something important about the difference between authority and volume. When Marin turned from the stove, she found Everett standing in the kitchen doorway. He had been there for the entire exchange, she realized, watching, not interfering, letting her handle it because he understood that authority given by a man could be taken by a man, but authority earned by a woman belonged to her and could not be revoked. "Well done," he said, nothing more. But the two words carried a weight that settled into Marin's chest and stayed there warm and solid as a hearthstone. On the fifth day, Beckett taught her the deeper architecture of the ranch's finances. Marin bent over ledgers for hours, tracing the flow of money through the operation, with the focused attention of a woman who found numbers not just useful but beautiful, each column a story told in the language of commerce. And she found something that made her sit up straight, her finger pressed against a line item that did not belong. Lumber purchases from Patterson's store, 25% above the going rate, not dramatically high, not obviously wrong. The kind of discrepancy that lived in the space between reasonable and suspicious, invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. But Marin had kept books for her father's store for 3 years, and her father had taught her that the most dangerous thieves were the ones who stole small amounts consistently, who relied on the cumulative effect of minor overcharges rather than the dramatic impact of a single large theft. She cross-referenced 3 months of invoices, calculated the aggregate discrepancy, and presented her findings to Beckett with the careful precision of someone who understood that questioning a man's oversight of his own business was dangerous ground, but who also understood that dangerous ground was still ground and could be walked on if you placed your feet correctly. Beckett stared at the numbers, then at Marin, then back at the numbers. "Patterson's been overcharging her," he said slowly, "for months. Nobody caught it. The individual amounts are small enough to look normal. It's only visible in aggregate over a quarter." Something changed in Beckett's expression. The sardonic distance that he wore like armor, the cool analytical detachment that kept the world at arm's length cracked, just slightly. And underneath it, Marin glimpsed genuine respect. Not the obligatory kind that men offered women as a social courtesy, the earned kind, the kind that only appeared when someone demonstrated competence that could not be denied. "I'll renegotiate his contract tomorrow. And Marin." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight that went beyond business. "From now on, I want you reviewing every invoice before I sign off. Every single one." That evening, Soren taught her to ride properly, pushing her past the cautious walk she had been managing into a trot that jarred her spine and rattled her teeth. When she nearly fell, his hands were there, large and warm and steady on her waist. And for one suspended moment, the world consisted of nothing but the pressure of his palms and the amber of his eyes, close enough to see the individual rays of color radiating from his pupil like sunlight through whiskey. Then he stepped back, grinning the grin that had been the first crack in her armor. "You're fine. Bertie won't quit on you. Neither will we." Nella Mercer came to the boarding house that evening with an apology that was half genuine and half strategic. Hap had made his position clear in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. "I was wrong to attack you publicly. The truth is, I wanted Veda to marry into the Drummond family. When they chose you instead, I was hurt on her behalf." "I understand," Marin said. "We don't have to be friends. But Hap works for Everett, and you and I will see each other regularly. I'd prefer not to have a war." "Agreed." Then Nella added almost as an afterthought that was clearly anything but, "Veda was very disappointed. My niece is not the kind of girl who lets go of things easily. I hope you understand what that means." The warning sat in Marin's stomach like a stone heavy and indigestible. On the sixth day, everything changed. They rode to the northern boundary of Elkhorn Ridge, following Silver Creek upstream to where it emerged from a rocky canyon so narrow that the sky above was reduced to a strip of blue between walls of ancient stone. The water ran clear and cold over smooth rocks, and the world was so quiet Marin could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the blood moving through her veins, could hear the mountain breathing around her with the slow, patient respiration of something that had existed long before humans arrived and would continue long after they were gone. Everett Beckett and Soren sat their horses in a line, and Marin sat Bertie beside them, and for a long moment nobody spoke because the land was saying everything that needed to be said. The mountain above them, the creek beside them, the sky spreading overhead in the deepening blue of late afternoon, and the silence between four people who were deciding together whether to build something that would last. Then Marin broke the silence. "I need to tell you something." All three brothers turned to her, waiting, three pairs of amber eyes patient as the mountains they lived among. "When you ask me formally tomorrow, my answer will be yes." The stillness that followed was not the stunned silence of the platform. It was deeper, more private, more sacred. The silence of something important being recognized and honored. The silence that fills a church before vows are spoken. The silence that exists in the space between one life ending and another beginning. "You're certain?" Everett asked, and his voice was rougher than usual, as though something in his throat had tightened against an emotion he was not prepared to feel. "As certain as I can be about stepping into a life I've never lived in a place that broke the last woman who tried. But I've seen enough this week to know that what you're offering is real. Hard work, yes. Isolation, yes. Challenges I can't even imagine yet. But also purpose, partnership, the chance to build something that matters with people who see me for what I am instead of what I'm not. I want that. I want this." Everett dismounted and walked to where Bertie stood. He reached up, slowly, giving Marin time to pull away, and cupped her face in one calloused hand. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, gentle despite the roughness of his skin, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that made the vast Montana sky and the ancient mountains and the endless rolling land feel small and intimate, and entirely contained within the space between two people looking at each other with nothing hidden. "I make you a promise right now, Marin Ellery. I will never take you for granted. I will never treat you as less than my full partner, and I will stand beside you against anyone who tries to make you feel small or worthless or like you don't belong on this mountain. You have my word, and my word has never been broken." Beckett dismounted and stood beside his brother. His expression was the most serious Marin had ever seen, it all the sardonic wit stripped away to reveal the bedrock underneath. "You'll always know everything. Finances, decisions, plans, no secrets. No being shut out, no discovering bad news after the damage is done. That's my promise." Soren was last. He did not dismount. He sat his horse and looked down at Marin with eyes that held none of their usual humor, replaced instead by something raw and fierce and absolutely certain. Something that had been there all along beneath the laughter and the charm, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. "You will never stand on a platform again," he said. "Never, because now you have a home." The words entered Marin's chest and lodged there deep in the place where 7 rejections had carved a hollow she had thought could never be filled. Not filled exactly. Nothing could undo what had been done to her, the years of invisibility, the slow erosion of belief in her own worth, the accumulated weight of being told through silence and averted eyes that she was not enough. But something was being built in that hollow space, now laid down timber by timber, stone by stone, the way these 3 men had built their ranch in a valley that everyone said could not support one. Something that felt for the first time in 7 years like foundation rather than ruin. She looked at these 3 men who had chosen her when no one else would, who had seen strength where others saw only failure, who were offering not rescue but partnership, not charity but respect. "Thank you," she whispered, and the words were hopelessly inadequate for what she meant, but they were all she had, and sometimes all you have is enough. They rode back toward Cutter's Bend as the sun dropped toward the mountains, painting the sky in colors so vivid they seemed impossible, oranges and purples, and golds that no painter would dare commit to canvas for fear of being called a liar. The light caught Marin's hair beneath her new wide-brimmed hat, turning it to honey, and she sat Bertie with a confidence that had not existed 6 days ago, her body finally remembering what it meant to move in partnership with a living creature instead of fighting against it. Tomorrow Everett would ask her formally. Tomorrow she would say yes, and the day after that she would stand in a small white church and make promises that would bind her life to theirs, and the woman who had been invisible for 7 years would finally permanently, irrevocably be seen. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, riding through that impossible sunset with 3 men whose gazes kept finding her face as if confirming she was still there, still real, still choosing them, as surely as they had chosen her, Marin. Ellery felt something stronger than hope building in her chest. Hope was too fragile a word, too small for the thing taking shape between heartbeats. What she felt was certainty. The bone-deep, mountain-solid certainty of a woman who had finally found the place where her strength was not a liability, but a necessity, where her sharp mind was not a threat, but a treasure, where being exactly who she was not just acceptable, but essential. She was riding toward her life, and for the first time in 7 years, she was not afraid of what she would find when she had arrived. The proposal came on Friday evening in the warm parlor of Hap and Nella Mercer's home, with firelight throwing golden shadows on the walls, and the smell of roast beef and fresh bread lingering in the air from a dinner that had been surprisingly, almost miraculously pleasant. Nella Mercer had made an effort, real effort, the kind that cost a proud woman something to produce and that could not be faked or performed because the cost was visible in every gesture. The table had been set with her best china, the kind that only came out for occasions that mattered, and the conversation had been steered towards safe harbors by Hap, who understood the politics of this evening better than anyone and who navigated them with the dry, understated skill of a man who had been managing difficult situations for 15 years. Hap told stories of the early days with the affection of a man looking back on something that had nearly killed him, but that he would not trade for anything. 500 acres, he said, shaking his head, with the retrospective wonder of a man who had lived long enough to see the impossible become ordinary. 24 head of cattle, 3 boys who didn't know enough to be scared of anything, including the mountain that was trying to freeze them to death every winter. And Everett standing in the middle of all that, nothing, looking at a valley that everyone said was too high and too cold and too remote, saying, "This is going to be the biggest ranch in Montana." I thought he was out of his mind. Figured I'd stay a year, collect my wages, and move on to something sensible. 15 years later, I'm the one who was wrong. After dinner in the parlor with the fire crackling and Hap and Nella standing as witnesses, and Pearl almost certainly watching through a crack in the kitchen door, because Pearl Ashby could not have stayed away from this moment if her life depended on it. Everett Drummond lowered himself to one knee in front of Marin's chair. The gesture was old-fashioned, almost formal, completely unexpected from a man who had presented himself as the embodiment of frontier pragmatism, a man who dealt in cattle and acreage, in the hard mathematics of mountain survival, who spoke in facts rather than feelings, and measured the world in what could be built rather than what could be felt. But there he was, on one knee, on Nella Mercer's good carpet, his amber eyes level with Marin's, his brothers flanking her like sentinels standing guard over something precious. Beckett on her left, his sardonic armor nowhere in evidence, his face showing nothing but open, undefended sincerity. Soren on her right, whose usual warmth had deepened into something fierce and protective, a man who had stood beneath her window and convinced her to stay with nothing but the truth. Everett opened a small velvet box. Inside, a gold ring set with a single emerald, small but vivid, catching the firelight and throwing it back in green sparks that danced across the walls like small living things made of light and promise. "We chose emerald," Everett said, and his voice, usually so controlled, usually so carved from the same granite as the mountains he lived among, carried a roughness that spoke of emotion held carefully in check of a man who had spent 4 years rebuilding the walls around his heart and was now choosing deliberately to lower them. "Because it's the color of your eyes." Marin looked at the ring, at the stone that matched her eyes, at the fact that these three men who could have bought any jewel in the territory, any diamond or ruby or sapphire that money could acquire, had chosen this one because it reminded them of her. The specificity of that, the personal attention embedded in a piece of metal and stone, undid something in her chest that she had been holding together with wire and will for 7 years. Something cracked. Something gave way. And what rushed in through the opening was not weakness, but its opposite, the terrifying, liberating strength of allowing yourself to be moved by someone else's care. "This week I watched you face judgment and skepticism with more grace than most people manage in a lifetime," Everett said. "Watched you work harder than anyone had a right to ask, learning things that were outside everything you had ever known. Watched you be honest when honesty was difficult and brave when bravery was the only option available. And I realized that choosing you on that platform was the best decision I've made in years. Maybe the best decision I've ever made." He paused and the firelight moved across his face, illuminating the scar through his eyebrow, the lines carved by weather and grief and the particular loneliness of a man who had buried his wife and his child on the same day, and then stood up and kept working because the mountain did not care about grief, and the cattle still needed feeding, and 35 men still needed leading. And the world kept turning, regardless of whether you wanted it to stop. "I'm not offering you an easy life. I'm not offering romance or luxury or freedom from work that will leave you bone-tired at the end of every day. What I'm offering is partnership with three men who will respect you, value you, and stand beside you through whatever comes. Winter storms that bury the ranch for weeks, calving seasons that last from midnight to midnight, the loneliness of living on a mountain where the nearest neighbor is a day's ride away. All of it, but also the good. The spring when the valley turns green overnight. The foals born in the morning light. The satisfaction of building something that lasts in country that tests everything." He looked at the ring in its box, then back at her face. "Marin Ellery, will you marry me? Will you become the mistress of Elkhorn Ridge and a member of this family?" She looked at this man kneeling before her. At Beckett, standing to her left, every layer of protective distance removed his face, showing the raw and vulnerable truth of a man who had found something he did not want to lose. At Soren on her right, whose eyes held none of their usual humor, replaced instead by something fierce and absolute, the look of a man who had decided and would not be moved. Every rejection, every platform, every man who had looked past her as if she were made of air. On all of it had been leading here. To this room, this fire, this ring, these three men who looked at her and saw not what she lacked, but what she carried. Not her plainness, but her persistence. Not her poverty, but her capability. Not the woman the world had told her she was, but the woman she had been all along, waiting for eyes sharp enough to recognize her. Yes, Marin said. Yes, I'll marry you. Everett slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly as if it had been measured for her hand alone, and the emerald caught the firelight and held it like a small green flame burning in the space between one life and another. He rose to his feet, lifted her hand to his lips, and pressed a kiss against her knuckles with a tenderness that made the roughness of his calloused skin feel like the most honest form of gentleness in the world. From the direction of the kitchen came a muffled sound that was unmistakably Pearl Ashby crying tears of fierce romantic joy. The evening before the wedding, 3 women appeared at Mrs. Calder's boarding house with packages and nervous smiles. A young wife named Mrs. Lawson, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, pressed a parcel into Marin's hands with trembling earnestness. Inside was a cream silk wedding dress, simple but beautiful save for a daughter who was only 7 and would not need it for years. Please, Mrs. Lawson said, her voice carrying the quiet conviction of a woman who understood what this gift meant because she understood what it meant to need one. I'd be honored if you wore it. Behind her, Adelaide brought wildflowers she had somehow found, despite the late-season purple and white blooms that looked like they had been conjured from the earth by sheer determination. And Mrs. Calder promised to alter the dress overnight, her capable hands already measuring and planning as she held the silk to the light. These women who had whispered about Marin days ago were now offering her gifts, and Marin understood that acceptance, like rejection, sometimes arrived without warning, without logic, without anything to distinguish the moment it changed, except the quiet shifting of hearts that had decided for reasons they might never fully articulate to open rather than close. The wedding took place the following morning in the small white church at the center of Cutter's Bend. And despite the Drummond brothers' stated preference for something simple and private, half the town turned out to witness the event. They came out of curiosity, out of skepticism, out of the irresistible human compulsion to watch when something unprecedented was happening, when the established order of things was being rearranged by forces that could not be predicted or controlled. The bride from the platform, the one who had been passed over 7 times, about to become the most powerful wife in the territory. Nobody wanted to miss it. Marin wore the cream silk dress that Mrs. Lawson had given her. Mrs. Calder had worked through the night, and the result was something that defied the modesty of its materials. Taken in here, let out there, hemmed and adjusted until it fit Marin as though it had been sewn for her by someone who knew the exact geography of her body. Simple but elegant, modest but beautiful. The kind of dress that did not compete with the woman wearing it, but instead stepped aside and let her be seen. Wildflowers were threaded through her honey blonde hair, small bursts of purple and white against the warm gold. The cameo brooch at her throat, the one thing she had kept from her mother, caught the morning light and held it. And when Marin looked in the mirror one final time before leaving for the church, the woman who looked back was someone she barely recognized. Not because of the dress or the flowers or the borrowed beauty of silk and lace. Because of the expression in her own green eyes. Confidence. Not the brittle defensive confidence of a woman pretending she did not care. The real kind. The kind that came from knowing you had been chosen for exactly who you were by people who had looked at everything you were and decided it was enough. More than enough. The 3 Drummond brothers stood at the altar in dark suits, shoulder to shoulder, a wall of quiet, masculine authority that made the small church feel like a cathedral. Everett in the center, Beckett to his left, Soren to his right. When Marin appeared in the doorway framed by the September sunlight streaming through the open doors behind her, something happened to Everett Drummond's face that the people of Cutter's Bend would talk about for years. His expression, always so controlled, always so carved from the same stone as the mountains that ringed his ranch, broke open. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical display of a man performing for an audience. But with the subtle, devastating shift of a man seeing something he had not known he was looking for and recognizing it with the kind of certainty that rearranges everything. His eyes changed, his jaw softened. The granite that had protected him for 4 years cracked, and what showed through the crack was not weakness, but the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of a man who had allowed himself to want something again after years of believing that wanting was too dangerous to risk. Reverend Coulter performed a simple ceremony. Traditional words about commitment and partnership in the building of a life together, spoken by an elderly man whose gentle eyes held the wisdom of someone who had presided over enough marriages to know the difference between the ones that would last and the ones that were already dying before the vows were finished. He looked at Marin and Everett and seemed satisfied by whatever he saw. Marin spoke her vows clearly, promising to honor and stand beside, to build and maintain, to face difficulty with courage and joy with gratitude. Everett spoke his with the measured deliberation of a man who understood that words once given were binding in ways that went beyond law, that operated in the territory of honor, where the only enforcement was a man's relationship with his own integrity. He promised to respect and protect, to value her as his equal, to never take her presence for granted. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Everett cupped Marin's face in both hands and kissed her, brief and soft, and carrying the weight of everything he had not been able to say with words. A promise made with lips instead of language. Marin felt something settle deep in her chest, a rightness she had not expected, a sense of pieces fitting together that she had not known were meant to connect. She signed the marriage certificate with a hand that did not tremble. Marin Drummond. The name looked strange on the page, unfamiliar, like a word in a language she was just beginning to learn. But it also looked right. It looked like it belonged there. And so for the first time in 7 years did she. The ride up the mountain to Elkhorn Ridge as husband and wife was different from every other time Marin had made the journey. The light was different. The air tasted different. The way Bertie moved beneath her felt different, as if even the horse understood that something fundamental had shifted, and the woman in the saddle was not the same woman who had first climbed this trail a week ago with fear in her throat and $17 in her carpet bag. Everett rode beside her, not ahead leading the way as he had on previous rides. Beside her, matching his stallion's pace to Bertie's smaller stride, riding as an equal rather than a guide. Beckett and Soren flanked them, and the four of them moved through the mountain landscape in a formation that felt natural, felt right, felt like the physical expression of the partnership they had promised in the church below. At the ranch, wildflowers filled vases in every room, and clean sheets carried the scent of mountain lavender, and the smell of something excellent came from Cookie's kitchen. Someone, probably Hap and Nella, working together in an act of quiet redemption, had taken the time to make the house look lived in and loved, to give it the warmth that Everett had admitted it lacked, the warmth that had departed when Rosalind died and had never returned until now. That first evening, Cookie served dinner for two in the main house dining room. Candlelight softened the room. The house settled into quiet around them. They talked about practical things, schedules for the coming weeks. Marin's gradual assumption of household duties, the approaching winter, and what preparations remained. Ordinary conversation. But underneath it flowed a current of something new, the quiet awareness that this was permanent, that they had chosen this in each other, and that the life they were building started now. Later, Everett knocked softly on the bedroom door before entering. The courtesy of it, the respect embedded in that small gesture of asking permission to enter a room that was now legally his, loosened something in Marin's chest that she had been holding tight all day. "We go at whatever pace feels right to you," he said quietly. "There's no rush. We have our whole lives." The door closed softly behind them, and the mountain held its silence around the house like cupped hands holding something fragile, and the moonlight came through the window and painted silver patterns on the floor, and whatever passed between them in that room belonged to them alone. When morning came, everything between them had changed in the quiet way that the most important changes always happen, not with thunder and lightning, but with the soft, persistent pressure of two people choosing each other in the smallest and most intimate of ways. 3 months passed, and Marin Drummond built herself into the architecture of Elkhorn Ridge Ranch, the way mortar fills the spaces between stones, becoming invisible in the best way possible, essential to the structure, even when no one noticed her individual presence. She reorganized Cookie's kitchen, introducing an inventory system that reduced waste by a third and ensured supplies were ordered before they ran out rather than after, anticipating needs before they became emergencies. She took over the household accounts entirely, her precise hand tracking every dollar with the meticulous care of a woman who had known poverty intimately and understood the difference between abundance and carelessness. She rode Bertie across the property with increasing confidence, learning the mountain landscape the way a reader learns a new language, one word at a time, until suddenly the sentences made sense and the story became clear. The Cowboys accepted her gradually, then completely, then with the quiet devotion of men who had discovered that someone was paying attention to the details of their daily existence. She learned their names, their habits, their small preferences. Jenkins liked his coffee black and bitter enough to strip paint. Young Talbot preferred biscuits broken in half and soaked in gravy until they fell apart. Old Pete had a bad knee that predicted weather better than any almanac and needed a chair with extra padding at the dining table. These were small things, but they accumulated into something larger. A sense that someone cared, that the place they came home to after 14 hours in the saddle was not just a building but a home. Morale improved. Complaints decreased. Cookie, whose permanent scowl had not shifted even at the wedding, was heard humming while he worked, which Hap claimed had not happened in 15 years, and which he attributed directly to Marin's spice organization system. The relationship between Marin and Everett grew in the spaces between work and obligation. Evening hours spent reviewing ledgers by lamplight, his hand occasionally reaching across the desk to cover hers when a number pleased him or a problem was solved. Quiet conversations on the porch, watching stars emerge over the mountains. The silence between them comfortable now, in the way that silence is only comfortable between people who have nothing to prove and nothing to hide. The gradual accumulation of small intimacies that meant more than grand gestures. A hand on the small of her back as she passed through a doorway. A cup of coffee placed on her desk without being asked for. The way he began pausing at the window when she rode in from the lower pastures, watching her approach, with an expression he probably did not realize was visible from a distance, but that Marin saw and held close to her heart like a secret treasure. Beckett treated her as a full partner in the ranch's financial operations, consulting her on every significant expenditure, deferring to her judgment on matters of household economy, with a respect that was all the more meaningful for being earned rather than given. Soren taught her to ride well enough that Hap, watching from the corral fence one crisp October morning, as Marin brought Bertie through a series of tight turns with easy confidence, nodded slowly and said with genuine admiration, "Give her a few more weeks. She'll ride it like she was born on this mountain." Then winter arrived, and it came with teeth. On Elkhorn Ridge, winter was not a season. It was a siege. Snow fell in quantities that defied comprehension, burying the ranch in white silence for weeks at a time, sealing the road to Cutter's Bend under drifts so deep that even the strongest horse could not push through. Temperatures dropped to numbers that hurt to speak aloud. The world contracted to the boundaries of the ranch itself, and beyond those boundaries existed nothing but white and wind and the ancient, indifferent cold of mountains that had been practicing winter since before humans learned to build fires. In the first week of November, the cattle began to weaken. Subtly at first, a few animals off their feed, a cow that should have been gaining weight for winter losing it instead, then more and more, until Hap came to Everett with the weathered face of a man delivering news he did not want to deliver and said, "Something's wrong with the herd, boss. Can't figure it, water's clean, pasture's as good as it gets this time of year, but the stock is dropping condition like they're eating air instead of feed." Everett and his brothers spent 2 days checking everything: water sources, pasture quality, Parasites, disease, they found nothing. The cattle continued to decline, growing thinner and more listless with each passing day, and the specter of losing significant numbers of stock to winter starvation began to take shape in conversations that grew more urgent and more frightened as the temperature dropped and the snow deepened, and the road to town disappeared under a white ocean that showed no sign of receding. Marin found the answer where she found most answers, in the numbers. She had been reviewing the ranch's supply invoices as part of her regular duties, a task Beckett had assigned her after she discovered Patterson's overcharging. The invoices were organized by date and supplier, and as she worked through the autumn purchases, a line item caught her attention in the way a wrong note catches a musician's ear. A large purchase of hay from a supplier called Gresham and Sons. 40 tons delivered in September, enough to supplement the ranch's own hay production through the winter months. The price was listed at 30% below market rate. 30% below market. For 40 tons of hay delivered to a mountain ranch at the end of a long supply road. That was not a bargain. That was an impossibility. No legitimate hay supplier sold below market to a remote ranch unless they were absorbing costs they could not afford to absorb, and legitimate businesses did not absorb costs. They passed them on. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, clear as a church bell on a winter morning. When the price is too good to be true, Marin, it is not true. It is a lie wearing a price tag. She put on her coat and walked to the hay barn. The November wind cut through the ranch yard like a blade carrying snow crystals that stung her face and made her eyes water. The barn was dark and smelled of dry grass and the dusty sweetness of stored feed. She pulled a bale from the stack, carried it to the doorway where the gray winter light could reach it, and broke it open. The outside looked normal. Dried grass properly colored, properly textured. But when she pulled the bale apart, digging into its center with hands that grew cold and then numb, and then did not matter because what she was finding mattered more than cold, the interior told a different story. Rotted straw, sawdust, sand mixed in to add weight and maintain the shape that real hay would have. The bale was a shell of fraud wrapped in a thin layer of legitimacy designed to look like feed from the outside, while containing almost nothing of nutritional value on the inside. 40 tons of lies. Enough false hay to slowly, invisibly starve an entire herd through a mountain winter, and enough time between delivery and discovery to make replacement nearly impossible once the road was sealed. Marin stood in that barn doorway with frost forming on her eyelashes and the wind howling through the yard, and the full devastating scope of what had been done settling into her understanding like stones sinking into deep water. This was not accident. This was not negligence. This was sabotage conducted with the patient, methodical precision of someone who understood that the most effective attacks were the ones that looked like bad luck until it was too late to fight back. She was carrying the evidence to the ranch office when she heard the shouting. The sound came through the closed office door with the particular resonance of fury, the deep percussive anger of men who had been pushed to the edge of their restraint and were no longer sure they could hold the line. Not ordinary raised voices. These carried the harmonic of something breaking of bonds, being stressed beyond their tolerance of a unity that had held for 34 years, beginning to fracture under the weight of a crisis that none of them knew how to solve. Marin opened the door and stepped into a scene she had never witnessed before and had hoped never to witness. The three Drummond brothers, who had moved through every challenge of the past 3 months with the unified precision of a single organism, were at war with each other. Everett stood behind the desk, his hands flat on the surface, his shoulders rigid with the particular tension of a man holding himself back from physical action through sheer force of will. His eyes blazed with the cold, focused rage of a man who had identified his enemy and was prepared to ride out and meet that enemy face to face regardless of consequences. I'm riding down to Cutter's Bend tomorrow, finding Gresham, looking him in the eye, getting answers about this hay or getting something else. Beckett stood opposite, arms crossed, his face white with an anger that expressed itself not in heat but in ice the dangerous cold of a man whose analytical mind was screaming warnings that his brothers were too furious to hear. That is exactly the wrong move. If someone set this up and it has Nolan Creed's fingerprints all over it, then riding down the mountain in a rage is exactly what they want. You lose your temper, you give them the incident they need. This is sabotage, Everett. You don't fight sabotage with your fists. You fight it with evidence and strategy. Soren stood between them, one hand raised as if preparing to physically separate his brothers if the argument crossed the line from words to something worse. His easy charm was nowhere in evidence, replaced by the hard-edged intensity of a man being forced to choose sides in a family conflict that had no good sides to choose. Beckett's right about strategy but wrong about timeline. We don't have months to build a case. If we don't get real feed for these cattle in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we lose animals. Winter's closing in. The road could seal any day. Sometimes you have to move before you're ready. I'm not calculating, Beckett shot back. I'm trying to keep this family from making a mistake that whoever planned this can exploit. And I'm trying to keep our cattle alive, Everett said, his voice dropping to a register that was more dangerous than any shout. Then what's the play? Soren demanded. Ride down there with what? A speech about honor. Whoever did this doesn't care about honor. They care about watching us fail. The argument spiraled, 3 voices rising and colliding and fracturing the air in the office like stones thrown at glass. Everett hit the desk with enough force to rattle the inkwell. Beckett stepped back, his expression closing like a door being slammed shut. Soren moved between them with both hands raised, the peacemaker straining under the weight of a piece that was crumbling faster than he could shore it up. Stop, Marin's voice cut through the chaos. All 3 of you, stop. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the authority of a woman who had spent 3 months earning the right to speak in this room, who had proven through daily, consistent, unglamorous work that her judgment was sound and her presence was not decorative but essential. The 3 brothers snapped toward her, their expressions blazing with redirected intensity. 3 pairs of amber eyes burning with the frustration of men who had been arguing in circles and were desperate for someone to show them the way out. Everett, you're right that we need action. Beckett, you're right that a confrontation is exactly what whoever did this wants. Soren, you're right that we're running out of time. But all 3 of you are missing something. She walked to the desk and laid down the broken bale sample she had carried from the barn, the rotted straw and sawdust spilling across the wood like evidence presented in a court of law. Then she opened the ledger she had been carrying under her arm and turned to the pages she had marked. I've been working on this for 2 weeks, since I first noticed the cattle losing condition and couldn't figure out why. I checked the hay because the invoices didn't add up. 30% below market price for 40 tons delivered to a mountain ranch. That's not a deal. That's a trap. She laid out the numbers she had been quietly assembling since the first signs of trouble, working through columns of figures by lamplight, while the rest of the house slept, building a solution from the raw materials of information, the way these 3 men had built their ranch from the raw materials of the land. The solution has 3 parts. First, immediate feed. I've inventoried everything on this ranch. We have 200 bags of grain stored for the horse string. If we ration it carefully, prioritizing the pregnant cows and the young stock, we can keep the critical animals alive for 3 weeks. I've calculated the distribution. Amounts per animal per day. It works. She turned the page. Second, replacement hay. The Henderson Ranch, 40 miles east through the lower pass. The pass is not sealed yet. Barely open, but passable for another week, maybe 10 days. Henderson had a surplus harvest this year. I know this because Beckett received correspondence from Henderson last month about a possible bulk sale. If we send a team now today, before the pass closes, we can buy enough real hay to replace what Gresham sold us. I've estimated costs and quantities. She turned to the final page. Third, evidence. I've preserved samples of the fraudulent hay. I've documented the invoices, the delivery records, the price discrepancies. I've already written a detailed account and sent it to a lawyer in Helena by post before the road sealed. If Gresham has connections to anyone in this territory who might have orchestrated this, the evidence is safe outside their reach. The silence that followed was not the silence of skepticism or surprise. It was the silence of three men recalculating their understanding of the situation in real time, adjusting their assumptions to accommodate information they had not possessed 30 seconds earlier, recognizing that the woman standing before them with flour under her fingernails and a ledger in her hands had been fighting their war before they even knew the war had started. "You've been planning this," Beckett said slowly, not a question, a recognition. "For 2 weeks, since the cattle started losing weight. I could see where it was heading, so I prepared an alternative before we needed one." Soren was the first to react. He laughed a genuine laugh that broke the tension in the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, filling the space with warmth that had been absent for days. "Everett, brother, you picked the right woman." Everett looked at Marin across the desk. His anger had not disappeared, but it had been transformed, redirected from the blind rage of a man with no options into the focused determination of a man who had just been given one. He nodded once, the decisive nod, the one that meant a decision had been made and would not be revisited. "Show me everything, every number, every calculation. Then you and Soren take a team to Henderson at first light." The trip to Henderson took 3 days. 3 days of hard riding through mountain passes where the snow was already knee-deep on the horses and the wind cut through every layer of clothing like it was made of paper. Marin rode Bertie through conditions that would have broken the spirit of most people who had not spent their lives on horseback, her face numb, her hands aching inside her gloves, her body screaming for rest that she refused to give it. She did not complain. She did not slow down. She did not ask for special consideration or acknowledge the pain that lived in every muscle and every joint. She rode beside Soren and the four cowboys who accompanied them, and she kept up. And when Soren looked at her across the campfire on the second night, with an expression that had nothing to do with the warmth she needed and everything to do with the respect she had earned, she understood that something had shifted between them that went beyond the rescue of cattle or the politics of ranch management. At Henderson's ranch, Marin negotiated. She sat across from a weathered rancher twice her age and laid out numbers with the precise, unhurried confidence of a woman who knew her figures were right and who understood that confidence properly deployed was worth more in a negotiation than any amount of bluster. Henderson studied. Her studied the numbers, studied the Drummond brand on the horses in his yard, and sold them 40 tons of good hay at a fair price with a handshake and the quiet comment, "Drummond boys finally found someone smarter than all three of them put together." They returned to Elkhorn Ridge with a wagon train of real feed, and the cattle were saved, and the crisis that had threatened to break the ranch and the brotherhood at its center was resolved not with violence or confrontation, but with a woman's sharp eyes, careful numbers, and the stubborn refusal to let the people she loved be destroyed by a threat they could not see. Everett was standing on the porch when they rode in a silhouette against the late afternoon sky, watching the wagons come up the trail with an expression that contained 4 years of loneliness and 3 months of growing certainty, and the raw, undisguised gratitude of a man who had just watched someone save everything he had spent his life building. He helped Marin dismount, his hands steady on her waist, and held her there for a moment longer than necessary. "You saved this ranch," he said. "I did my job. That's what partnership means." The defeat of the hay fraud did not end the tensions entirely. Nolan Creed, whose connection to Gresham and Sons was never proven, but universally suspected, made one final attempt to assert dominance. He hosted a gathering at his ranch in the Lower Valley, inviting territorial politicians, prominent business figures, and every ranching family of consequence in the region. The invitation to the Drummonds was clearly a challenge. Attend and be humiliated. Decline and be painted as mountain hermits too afraid to face civilized society. Everett wanted to refuse. Marin said they should go. If we don't show up, Creed tells everyone we're afraid. If we do, we show them we can't be broken. On his ground, in front of his people. The evening of the gathering, Marin dressed in the best dress Everett's money could buy, a deep green that matched her eyes and the emerald on her finger. She pinned her hair and stood before the mirror, studying her reflection, with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to ledgers and invoices and every other challenge that required seeing things as they were rather than as she wished them to be. Other women at the gathering would be younger, more beautiful, more fashionable. None of them had saved an 18,000-acre mountain ranch from ruin, using nothing but a ledger, a pencil, and the sharp mind that had once been considered a liability on 7 bride platforms. At the gathering, Creed played his hand with smooth confidence. He introduced Marin to his guests with a smile that dripped condescension. The bride from the platform. Remarkable story. The Drummond brothers have always been known for their unconventional choices. Marin smiled back, the smile she had perfected over 3 months of facing down judgment, a smile that was warm on the surface and steel underneath the smile of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had learned to use that underestimation as a weapon. Mr. Creed is too kind. The Drummond brothers didn't choose me for being unconventional. They chose me because I can read a ledger. Speaking of which, our new hay contracts with the Henderson Ranch are performing beautifully. I should thank you, Mr. Creed. It's remarkable how discovering that someone sold us 40 tons of fraudulent feed straw and sawdust disguised as hay pushed us to diversify our suppliers. We're actually in a stronger position now than before, and the evidence about that fraudulent shipment is sitting safely with the lawyer in Helena. Fascinating case. Someone should really look into who might have arranged such a thing. The silence that followed was exquisite. Creed's smile froze on his face like a mask that had suddenly stopped fitting. Around the table, politicians and businessmen exchanged glances that carried the rapid recalculation of men reassessing which horse to back in a race whose outcome had just become much less certain. Everett, sitting beside Marin, smiled. A real smile, rare and transformative, the kind that took years off his face and revealed the man he might have been if loss had not carved so much away. Beckett hid his expression behind his glass, but his eyes danced. Soren did not bother hiding anything. He grinned broadly across the table, the grin of a man watching someone he loved win a battle that mattered. The months that followed were not easy. They were never easy. Mountain life did not allow for ease. Winter continued with blizzards that buried the ranch in white silence. Spring brought mud and flooding and the exhausting miracle of calving season. Summer meant roundup, long days in the saddle through mountain meadows, dust and heat, and the bone-deep fatigue of labor that paused but never truly ended. But through it all, Marin stood. She ran the household with an efficiency that made Cookie openly declare her the best thing that had happened to Elkhorn Ridge since running water, which from Cookie was the equivalent of a standing ovation. She settled disputes among the cowboys with the calm authority of a woman who understood that men responded to fairness even when they resisted it. She built relationships with the women of Cutter's Bend, turning skeptics into allies through the persistent practice of being exactly who she was. Nella Mercer became an unlikely ally, then something approaching a friend. She came to the ranch one afternoon with a leather-bound journal and an apology that felt this time entirely genuine. Write down your first year, the challenges and the victories. Years from now, you'll want to remember how it began. She paused, then added quietly, Veda went to Portland, teaching music at a girls' academy. She's doing well, better than she would have done trying to force herself into a life that was never meant for her. 8 months after the wedding, on a May evening, when spring had finally loosened winter's grip and the mountain valley was alive with green, Marin sat in the ranch office with Everett reviewing the year. Lamplight filled the room with gold. Outside, the last light was fading from the peaks and the world smelled of new grass and snow melt and possibility. We did well this year, Everett said. Better than projected. Henderson contracts outperforming the old deals. Lost fewer than a dozen head over winter. That's the best number in 5 years. Cookie says the hands are happier than they've been in years, Marin added. Better food, better organization, fewer grievances. That affects productivity more than most people realize. That's you. That's your influence. Everett stood and moved around the desk. The lamplight caught the planes of his face, the scar, the lines, the amber eyes that had softened over 8 months in ways that Marin noticed even when no one else did. When I chose you on that platform, he said slowly, I believed I was making a practical decision, finding a capable partner, someone who wouldn't fold. He paused and Marin watched a wall being lowered, a door being opened that had been closed for 4 years. But somewhere over these months, watching you face down everything this mountain could throw at you without flinching, watching you comfort young Talbot when he got that letter about his mother finding you standing in the barn at midnight because you heard one of the horses coughing and couldn't sleep until you knew it was all right. Somewhere in all of that, Marin, I fell in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying and wonderful. I know that wasn't part of our arrangement, but I can't keep pretending that's all this is. You're not just my partner. You're the woman I wake up grateful for every morning. Beckett appeared in the doorway, his sardonic armor completely absent. He's right, though his delivery is about as elegant as a fence post. You changed this ranch, Marin, changed this family. And behind Beckett Soren, his face bright with an emotion he made no effort to conceal. 3 stubborn mountain men, the most hard-headed brothers in Montana territory. And you brought us to heel without even trying. Marin stood on legs that were not entirely steady. I love you too. I've been terrified to even think it because I didn't want to risk what we built. But you're not just my husband. You're not just my partners. You're the men who saw me when I was invisible. How could I not love you? Everett pulled her into his arms and the door closed softly, and the mountain held its silence around the house, and what passed between them belonged to them alone. 5 years later, Marin Drummond stood at the front of a schoolroom that smelled of chalk dust and young ambition, watching 22 children bend over their slate boards, practicing their letters with the fierce concentration that children brought to tasks they had not yet learned to find tedious. The schoolhouse had been built the previous year, funded by Elkhorn Ridge Ranch, and donations from families throughout the region situated on a piece of land halfway between the mountain and town that Marin had chosen specifically so that children from both could attend. It was her project, her vision, the thing she had been planning since the first winter when she realized that the children of ranch families and frontier homesteads were growing up without the education that could expand their worlds beyond the boundaries of the land their parents worked. She had designed the curriculum herself, taught the morning sessions, and then rode Bertie back up the mountain to manage the household she had trained a capable young woman named Sarah to handle during her absence. Through the schoolroom window, she could see the distant outline of Elkhorn Ridge against the mountain horizon. Her home. The words still carried weight, still meant something profound every time she allowed herself to think it consciously. After 7 years of not having one, the concept had not lost its power. She suspected it never would. The emerald ring caught the afternoon light as she moved between desks. 5 years of mountain ranch life had changed her hands, given them calluses that matched her husband's. But the ring still fit perfectly, and the stone still held its green fire, and every time she looked at it, she remembered a man on one knee in a firelit parlor, his rough voice saying the color of your eyes. That evening, Marin rode Bertie home through the spring twilight, her muscles pleasantly tired from a full day of teaching and managing and being needed. The ranch appeared over the last rise buildings, warm with lamplight smoke rising from Cookie's kitchen. Everett met her in the yard. He took Bertie's reins and helped her dismount with hands that knew her as well as she knew him. 5 years of building a life together, having created the kind of familiarity that went beyond attraction into something deeper, something that felt like gravity. He kissed her forehead. Good day. Wonderful day. Billy Yardley finally mastered long division. Mary Burris read an entire page without stumbling once. That's my brilliant wife. Inside warmth and lamplight and the smell of good food. Beckett at the parlor desk reviewing contracts, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up when she entered and nodded a small gesture that contained 5 years of mutual respect. Soren came through the back door, leading a young colt, all legs and nervous energy that he was training for a buyer in California. He saw Marin and grinned the same warm grin that had been the first crack in her armor 5 years ago, standing beneath her window in the moonlight. He winked, tipped an imaginary hat, Thomas, and led the colt toward the barn, whistling a tune that carried through the evening air like a thread of pure happiness. That night, lying beside Everett, moonlight painting silver patterns on the quilt that Nella Mercer had given them as a first anniversary gift, Marin allowed herself to think about the journey that had brought her to this place. 7 platforms, 7 rejections. 7 times she had stood in the sun and been found wanting by men whose vision was too narrow to see what she carried. Each rejection had felt like the end, like proof that the world had rendered its verdict and the verdict was permanent. But the rejections had not been endings. They had been clearings. Each one had removed an obstacle, pushed her forward, redirected her path toward the one place where she would be seen completely. Every man who had looked at her and seen nothing had been without knowing it, steering her toward the 8th platform. The last platform, the one where 3 dust-covered brothers would ride out of the mountains and look past every convention and every expectation and stop in front of a small, plain, fiercely intelligent woman with 7 failures behind her and nothing but stubborn will to carry forward. She had thought she was unwanted. In truth, she had simply been waiting to be found by the people whose vision mattered. From the woman nobody chose to the woman who changed everything. Children educated because she believed they deserved to be. A ranch thriving because she refused to let it fail. A community strengthened because she kept showing up even when showing up hurt. Love built not from passion or infatuation, but from the far more durable materials of honesty and respect, and the daily choice to stand together when standing apart would have been easier. Marin pulled closer to Everett, feeling his arm tighten around her in sleep, an unconscious gesture of possession and protection that he would probably deny if she mentioned it in the morning, but that she treasured precisely because it was unconscious, because it came from the part of him that did not calculate or strategize, but simply held on to what mattered. 7 rejections had led her here. To this man, this family, this mountain, this life that mattered far more than any of the lives she had imagined during those years of desperate platform standing. She had been tested by fire and refined by rejection, and what emerged was not a broken woman grateful for scraps, but a woman strong enough to deserve the life she had built. She had always been worth choosing. She just needed to wait for someone wise enough to see it, and she had.